Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Ellie's morning consisted of organizing the paperwork of her first client, Edgar Zavala. She was a newly hired caregiver at Lakeside Assisted Living and had just completed her 2-week training course. Edgar's profile was unremarkable. Hispanic male, 68 years old, widower with no military service. Previous employer, musician. Ellie made her way down the hall until she got to his room. She adjusted her scrubs, then knocked and stood back. "Hold on," a voice called out. She could hear what sounded like a commotion and someone scrambling around. The door soon opened, revealing an older, stocky Hispanic man with a bushy black mustache. The skin on his face was rugged and leather-like, but his hair was full with no signs of graying. He wore no expression, just a vacant stare.
"Hi, I'm Ellie. I'm your new caregiver."
The corners of Edgar's mouth then curled upward, wrinkling on his cheeks and forming a hearty smile. "Oh, hey, Ita! I've been expecting you. I'm Eddie." She smiled, and they shook hands. "Sorry about the mess. I've been trying to clean this place up."
"Well, Mr. Zavala, that's where I come into play. I can help you with that."
"Mister," Edgar said with a half-cocked grin. "Just call me Eddie. I don't want you making me feel older than I already am." Ellie smiled.
"It's like my grandpa used to always say, you'll get older too, just keep living."
"Smart man. Grandpas usually are." Edgar chuckled. Ellie reached into her bag and pulled out a form.
"So I have a checklist here of the services that we provide. Things like cooking, cleaning, stuff like that. If you can just check off the things that you need help with, that lets me know where I need to focus each time I come over."
Edgar put on his reading glasses and quickly checked off the boxes, then handed the form back to her.
"Wow, that was fast,"
she said as she stood there looking it over.
"Okay, well, what needs cleaned today?"
Edgar turned around and looked toward the kitchen. Dirty dishes were piled up, cluttering his outdated laminate countertop. "Like I said, I've been trying to clean this place up, but sometimes I just get sidetracked." Ellie slipped on her gloves and began washing dishes. Pretty soon she heard the strum of a guitar. "You like Mariachi, Ita?" Ironically, Ellie grew up with mariachi music often playing in her home.
"Oh yeah, Pedro Infante, Vicente Fernandez."
"Vicente Fernandez," Edgar said spiritedly. "What do you know about gente?" He then began strumming one of his songs while singing the lyrics. Ellie bobbed her head along to the music. After she finished the dishes, she called out to Edgar, who sat in the living room.
"You want anything to eat?"
"Maybe a grilled cheese sandwich."
"You sure that's all you want?"
"You can cook?"
"What kind of question is that to ask a Chicana?"
Edgar smiled as taco meat sizzled in the skillet. "I haven't had cooking like this since my wife Gloria passed away."
"I'm sorry,"
Ellie said.
"How did she pass, if you don't mind me asking?"
Edgar got quiet and sat his taco down.
"You don't have to answer that. It's really none of my business."
"Cancer. She was a good woman. I was away a lot working the mariachi circuit, and she was alone, raising the kids."
"Do you keep in touch with them?"
Edgar paused thoughtfully. "Nah. They both got caught up with drugs. We always live in the ghetto, surrounded by a bunch of devils. Being a mariachi man isn't all it's cracked up to be. I got paid in cacahuete."
That's probably the best time I ever had doing dishes for someone. You remind me a lot of my grandpa.
Ellie said after she finished cleaning up. Edgar grinned. Well, I promise I'll make more dishes for you to clean when you come back on Wednesday. That evening, Ellie carried several bags of groceries through her front door.
Can you help me?
She called out to her boyfriend, Nathan. He ran up to her and grabbed the bag that was falling out of her hands.
Thanks,
she said as she kissed him on the lips. How was your first day by yourself? Nathan asked.
Actually, not too bad. I just have 2 clients right now. Mrs. Hammond is this sweet old lady who collects these cute little teacups. Then there's Eddie. He seems really cool. He's a mariachi player, so I was serenaded while I scrubbed the dishes.
He was singing to you?
Don't worry,
Ellie said, smiling.
He's like 70 years old. He reminds me a lot of my grandpa, Antonio. It's so sad. He told me he lost his wife to cancer. So many of those people in there are all alone.
Wednesday afternoon, Ellie returned to check on Edgar. When he opened the door, his face lit up. What's up, Hita? I guess I didn't scare you off the other day. Ellie smiled pleasantly.
What are you up to today?
Edgar sat down on his recliner and sighed. You don't want to know. I gave my girlfriend my credit card number so she could buy herself a purse, and she ended up taking $500 out of my account.
It was a $500 purse?
Ellie said, astounded. No. She told me the other day that it was like $70.
Did you confront her about it?
I called my bank and they froze my account.
So you still haven't spoke to her?
She's overseas, and when I tried calling her about it, he said her number's no longer in service.
Oh my God,
Ellie said as she put on her giant rubber gloves.
How long have you 2 been dating?
About 2 weeks. Ellie raised her eyebrow.
So, are you sure this was a real person and not like one of those scammers?
Edgar got a confused look on his face. Yasmin was a real person, and she cared about me.
Okay,
Ellie said sheepishly as she looked down at the dishes she was washing. After a few minutes, Edgar picked up his guitar and smiled. He strummed a mariachi riff and began to sing, I know something better that awaits, someone who will give me love. His guitar rested on his belly as he stared into the kitchen at Ellie. He continued singing until she finally cracked a smile. He then let out a cheerful belly laugh and sat his guitar down. It's just money. Money is a lot like women. It comes and goes. Ellie looked at him thoughtfully.
Do you ever plan on remarrying?
Edgar smiled slyly as he looked over at her. Maybe, if that special mamacita ever comes along. After she finished up for the day, Ellie went into the break room and noticed that Sandra was crying. She walked up to her.
Are you okay? I just found out Mrs. Jenkins passed away last night. I'm sorry,
Ellie said as she hugged her.
I've taken care of her for almost 2 years now.
Behind the 2 women hung a bulletin board that celebrated the lives of residents who had recently passed away. Mrs. Jenkins' picture was pinned with care in the upper right-hand corner. The fragility of life was a sobering reality at Lakeside. For some, they began to see their mothers and fathers in those they care for, and the loss of a client can prove devastating. Ellie laid next to Nathan in bed that evening.
This job seems really rewarding, but also depressing at times.
Oh, yeah?
One of Sandra's clients passed away yesterday, and she took it pretty hard. I've never lost anyone close to me before,
Ellie said glumly. Nathan softly caressed her arm. Well, I can't think of anyone better than you to care for someone in their final days. I'm sure you'd bring them a lot of comfort. She smiled and hugged his chest. The following week, Ellie was assigned another client, Steve Rubin. She sat in the break room typing on her laptop. Tim, a nurse who had been there a few years, walked in and sat across from her. So, how's it going? Ellie looked up.
Pretty good, actually,
She said, grinning.
I just got assigned another client today.
Oh, yeah? Who'd you get? Ellie looked back down at her screen.
Steve Rubin.
Hey, Janelle, did you hear that? The new girl's got Creepy Steve. Janelle looked up, shaking her head, then continued digging through the refrigerator.
What's that supposed to mean?
Ellie asked. His female caregivers never seem to stick around too long.
Why?
Well, if I remember right, the last two girls said they both made him feel uncomfortable. They usually try to put him with a male, but I don't think there's any work in here right now. Ellie shook her head.
Great.
She then shifted her eyes back to her monitor and continued typing. She stood outside of Steve's door, preparing herself for what her training described as a challenging client. She let out a sigh, then knocked. After a few seconds, she could hear heavy footsteps approaching. A sloppy-looking gray-haired man in a stained wife-beater opened the door. He looked Ellie up and down, then cheaply grinned.
Well, hey there,
he said, finally looking her in the face.
I'm Ellie. I've been assigned as your new caregiver.
You are a sight for sore eyes. I'm just glad that fruity Asian guy finally ended up quitting.
Ellie forced a smile as she followed Steve into his living room. Naked and Afraid played on the TV. She looked down and reached into her bag.
I just have a client questionnaire for you to fill out. It covers what chores I need to do when I'm here.
Do they have sponge bath on there?
Actually, they do, but I don't do personal care.
What a shame.
Ellie got a miffed look on her face. Steve completed the form and handed it back to her, then crossed his arms. She looked it over.
Okay, so you need me to vacuum? Where's your vacuum cleaner?
He pointed to a closet.
Right in there.
He then went and sat down in front of the TV. Ellie plugged in the vacuum, then turned it on. It began noisily sucking up debris as she swept it from side to side as if the rug had been neglected for months. She could see him repeatedly glancing over at her from the corner of his eye. After a few more chores, she tried to quickly wrap up her visit. When she walked up to Steve, his head was buried in the TV.
Okay, so everything you checked was completed, and if you could just initial here, I'll be back on Wednesday,
she said as she handed him her list. He looked around the room, then pointed.
Over there. I can still see dust on the coffee table. Mind getting that for me? Dust triggers my asthma,
he said with a smirk. Ellie looked down at her watch, realizing she had less than 5 minutes to make it to Edgar's room. She forced a smile.
Sure.
Steve continued smirking to himself as he initialed her paper. After she finished, she gathered her forms and rushed down the hallway to Edgar's. What's wrong, Ita? Edgar said with a look of concern after he opened his door. He could tell she was upset. Ellie brushed it off and only smiled.
It's nothing, just a busy morning.
I was watching this Los Lobos concert on YouTube. McNichols Arena 1988. I was there. Yeah, I jammed with them that night right after their concert at the little bar just up the street. Ellie sat down on the couch, listening intently. Edgar's mind seemed to drift back in time, and you could hear the dust in his voice. That was one of the greatest times of my life. His eyes took on an emptiness. My kids would always look for a gift when I would get back from the road. He paused, his voice then lowered and his speech slowed. And Gloria would be waiting for me. And we were happy. I guess, whatever that means. Edgar just sat in front of the TV with the video paused.
Are you okay?
Ellie asked. He quickly snapped out of it and smiled. I'm fine. Just telling more boring old man stories, he said as he chuckled.
Well, Eddie, you can always tell them to me, and I'll always listen.
After visiting for a while longer, 40 minutes had passed.
Oh, crap,
Ellie said, looking at the clock.
What did you need done? I lost track of time.
We're doing it, Ita. Sometimes I don't always need chores done. I just need someone to keep me company, you know? He smiled and looked over at his pet fish. Elvis ain't much of a talker. Ellie giggled and turned her head to the side.
Well, I certainly won't object to that. I'll see you again on Wednesday, Eddie,
she said as she reached for her bag. Eddie winked at her. Deal. Ellie called Nathan on her way to the gym after work.
So I was sitting in the break room today and Tim, who's a nurse that's been there forever, was like, "Oh, you got creepy Steve, huh? None of his caregivers ever stick around."
Nathan got a puzzled look on his face. Why don't they stick around?
He said that he makes them all feel uncomfortable, and I can already tell that the guy's a creep. He just kept breathing through his mouth all loud and looking over at me. Then he watches me wipe down the table, and before I leave, wants me to wipe it down again because he said he could still see dust on it.
That dick, Nathan uttered. He obviously has a track record of harassing females, and yet they knowingly put him with another female? That's crazy. Maybe just talk to your supervisor if he keeps it up. Ellie sighed.
I'm not really trying to cause waves, but yeah, if he keeps it up, I will.
Edgar sat at his dining room table looking at Ellie's Facebook profile. He scrolled down her page, reading her posts and clicking on the comments. He grinned vicariously, with a part of himself longing to experience those moments with her that were so preciously captured in the photos. His phone suddenly rang, interrupting him. Hello? No, I already told you. I don't like taking that stuff. It makes me feel out of it. The voice on the other end continued talking as Edgar seemed to grow increasingly frustrated. You need to worry more about yourself and less about me, Vivian. The voice continued pleading with him until he finally hung up. He sat his phone down and huffed. It was Wednesday, and Ellie knocked at Steve's door. He answered, appearing to still have on the same stained wife beater that he was wearing when she visited him the last time.
Bathroom needs cleaned,
he mumbled as he went to sit back down in his recliner. She grabbed her cleaning supplies and made her way to the bathroom. She flipped on the light switch, then took one look at the toilet and gagged. Feces were splattered all up on the underside of the seat, coating the entire bowl like it had been fired out of a cannon. She slipped on some disposable gloves and with her bottle of Clorox wipes began wiping everything down.
You ever watch Naked and Afraid?
Steve hollered from the living room.
Not really,
Ellie said in an annoyed voice.
They just took this one bride to the hospital because she got all bit up on her tatas.
Ellie just shook her head.
Thanks for sharing that.
After she finished vacuuming, she stood next to the door, packing up her supplies. Steve got up from his chair and walked over to her. She could hear every labored breath he drew as he stood across from her, breathing through his mouth.
If you weren't on the clock, I'd offer you a drink and ask if you could stick around for a bit,
he said, smiling suggestively. Ellie could feel his eyes on her like laser beams. She got a repulsed look on her face and huffed in disbelief.
First off, I have a boyfriend, and secondly, you're being totally inappropriate, and next time I'll report you,
she exclaimed, storming out of the room. When she arrived at Edgar's a few minutes later, she still appeared upset. What's wrong? You look all flustered, Edgar asked. Ellie let out a heavy sigh and shook her head.
Today has just been rough.
You need me to beat someone up? Edgar said with a grin. Ellie didn't respond. Edgar's smile disappeared. Is something going on? Ellie began to feel comfortable confiding in Edgar.
I'm sorry. The guy before you just really pissed me off.
What happened?
He just keeps making these rude, inappropriate comments.
Is that why you looked upset the other day when you showed up?
Yeah.
What's this guy's name?
It doesn't matter, I'll be fine,
Ellie said as she gathered herself. Later, as she made Edgar's lunch in the kitchen, he walked over to where her clipboard sat. He flipped the page back and found Steve's profile. He quickly skimmed over the information and wrote down the room number that was listed. After he finished eating, Edgar looked over at Ellie and smiled. "Delicious," he said as he wiped his mouth with his napkin. His smile then faded and was replaced with a serious look. "Listen. Pardon my language, but anyone who would disrespect a good person like you is an asshole. And you can't listen to assholes, okay?" Ellie thanked Edgar with a warm nod, feeling better after her visit with him. As she left the facility that day, Edgar watched Ellie from his window as she walked to her car. He had his shirt off, which revealed an imposing vintage-style Chicano tattoo across his chest. It was of a woman wearing a sombrero with pistols tilted upwards on both sides. Black Magic Woman played softly in the background as he took a sip of his coffee. Seeing Ellie again that day brought a smile to his face, even if only in passing. The next day, Edgar walked down to room 217. The name engraved on the plastic door tag read Steve Rubin. He knocked and waited. Steve slowly opened the door.
"Can I help you?"
he said with a frown. "Are you Steve?"
"Who wants to know?"
Edgar smiled widely. "Hi, I'm Eddie. I live just down the hall," he said as he pointed with his thumb.
"Okay."
"I've seen you around. I need to move some stuff from my storage unit into my room, and I was just wondering if you wouldn't mind giving me a hand. Able-bodied guys like me and you are in short supply in this place." Steve began to shake his head when Edgar interjected. "I can pay you, and it would only take like an hour." Steve thought about it for a minute, knowing he could use the money.
"Is the stuff heavy?"
"No, it's just a mini fridge and a few light boxes."
"When you planning on doing this?"
"I'll probably catch the bus out of here at 1:30. Steve turned his head to look at the clock.
"Okay. I'll meet you at the bus stop at 1:30 then."
Edgar reached for his wallet. "Here's 20. I'll give you 20 more after we're done." Steve took the money and nodded. "Thanks, amigo," Edgar said with a beaming smile. Edgar walked down to the lobby before catching the bus and signed out. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he opened his sunglasses, placing them on his face, and exited through the front doors. A few minutes later, he saw Steve slowly lumbering down the sidewalk towards the bus stop.
"It's hotter than the devil's dick out here,"
Steve said, out of breath. He plopped down next to Edgar on the bench. The city bus soon made its way towards them, kicking up the dust and debris from under its tires. They pushed their way through a crowd of passengers, finding 2 open seats near the center row. Edgar looked over at Steve as he studied him. "You been at Lakeside long?"
"Little over a year."
"Like the place?" He looked at Edgar contemptuously.
"I don't know anyone who likes living there. Do you like it?"
Edgar shrugged his shoulders. "I've been at worse places, and it's a hell of a lot better than under a bridge." Steve smirked.
"Mr. Positivity."
"The caregivers are pretty good," Edgar said. Steve got a depraved look on his face.
"Got this one right now that's a real hottie."
"Oh, yeah?"
"I told her once you get a taste of Steve, you won't never leave."
Edgar smiled. "Good thing Medicare covers Viagra now. You're one crazy gringo." Steve finally caved and cracked a smile.
"So, how are we gonna get this stuff back to your room?"
Edgar paused for a minute. My sister's gonna pick us up in her minivan. Right here," Edgar said as the bus slowed to a stop a few miles up the road. They both got out, and Steve followed Edgar up the sidewalk. Pretty soon, the horizon opened up, revealing a large cluster of storage units off in the distance. Edgar pointed.
Over there. Thank God. My fucking corns are killing me. You didn't mention we'd be walking halfway across town today.
As they walked up to the front gate, Edgar carefully scanned his surroundings. He punched in the security code using his knuckle. The gate slowly opened, making an unpleasant shrieking noise as if it were crying out for lubrication. Edgar led Steve down a long stretch of pavement that was lined with faded blue garage doors, each one leading into an individual storage unit. He finally stopped in front of the one that belonged to him. He took his key out of his pocket, crouched down, and opened the padlock. He grabbed the handle and rolled the garage door up its track. The inside was dusty and cobweb-infested. It was filled with a full-size refrigerator, a few boxes, and an old tool cabinet.
Oh, hell no!
Steve exclaimed.
You said mini-fridge.
Edgar walked over to the tool cabinet.
Pinche pendejo,
he hissed under his breath. He slid open one of the drawers and grabbed a hammer out of it. Then he turned and faced Steve. His eyes seemed to darken to an impenetrable blackness.
The woman who cleans your room also happens to be my wife. What the hell are you talking about?
Steve said with a look of confusion. Edgar slowly pounded the hammer into his hand.
She told me all the disrespectful things you said.
Steve put his hands up and slowly backed away as a droplet of sweat trickled down his forehead.
I don't know why you brought me here or what kind of trip you're on, man, but I'm getting the hell out of here.
He then turned and quickly waddled in the other direction. He cut a sharp left, only to be met with a wall of garage doors. He bent over as he tried to catch his breath. Then he grabbed his asthma inhaler from his shirt pocket and took a puff off it. The veins in his temples swelled and his face glowed a crimson red from his hypertension. Sweat now visibly poured from his body. He turned his head to what sounded like footsteps close behind him, then took off scurrying again. He heard Edgar's voice echo somewhere off in the distance.
Run, Cucaracha. The exterminator's coming. Help!
Steve shouted at the top of his lungs. He began pounding on the garage doors as he ran, hoping to attract attention. He continued running up and down the rows of storage units until he turned a corner and finally seen the fence line. As he got closer to it, he saw a little girl riding her tricycle on the sidewalk. He grabbed onto the fence, desperately yanking on the chain links. The little girl screamed and ran off, abandoning her tricycle, which now had tipped over.
No! Wait! Tell your parents! Get help!
He turned and leaned his back up against the fence as he began to wheeze. He pulled out his inhaler, taking another puff off it, but nothing came out. He shook it in his hand furiously, then tried again, but it was empty.
Shit!
He shouted as he threw it on the ground. He clenched his chest as his lungs fought for air. His back slowly slid down the fence until he rested in a slumped-over, seated position. He continued wheezing and clutching at his chest when he saw Edgar from the corner of his eye. He walked up to Steve, who pointed at his inhaler on the ground. Edgar turned and looked at it.
Looks like it's out.
He then turned back to Steve and looked down at him. His face contorted into something cruel and almost inhuman. Steve's eyes widened with fear. Edgar began snickering wickedly and spit in his face.
You should watch who you make friends with, puto.
He then turned and walked off. A little while later, Edgar's sister Vivian picked him up at the 7-Eleven up the street. She was several years younger than him, but the stress and hardships that she endured throughout her life gave her an aged look beyond her years. On their way back to Lakeside, they drove past the barrage of police and emergency vehicles that were parked outside of the storage units.
I wonder what in the world happened over there,
Vivian said as she turned her head to look. Edgar kept drinking his soda and looking straight ahead. She sighed restlessly and tightened her grip on the wheel.
You know you're risking going back to that place if you're not taking your meds.
Edgar slammed his bottle onto his knee, sending soda splashing out of it.
No mames! Como chingas? Do I really have to hear this every time from you? I'm not going to be walking around that place like a zombie, okay? I'm not doing that no more.
Vivian dropped Edgar off in front of Lakeside. As he stomped through the lobby, a staff member called out to him, "Don't forget to sign in." Edgar stopped and turned around, scowling, as if the man had said something insulting to him.
Excuse me?
You just need to sign in. That's the policy for anyone who enters the building, he replied sheepishly.
How about you don't worry about me?
He then huffed and walked over to the sign-in sheet, scribbling his signature on it. The next morning, when Ellie showed up for work, Charles, her supervisor, called her into his office. When she stepped inside, she noticed a grave look on his face. I know this may be difficult for you, but we just learned earlier this morning that one of your clients passed away unexpectedly yesterday. Steve Rubin. It sounds like he may have suffered an asthma attack. At that moment, Ellie felt a rush of emotions, but grief wasn't one of them. She sat her bag down.
Did it happen here?
No, he was at some kind of storage facility.
I see.
He sighed. I just hate having to be the one to break this kind of news. Just take the morning off and we'll get you assigned another client soon enough. He looked at her thoughtfully. Are you okay? She nodded. Ellie showed up to Edgar's room a few minutes early that afternoon.
¿Qué pasa?
Edgar said with a grin as he opened the door.
¿Qué pasa?
Ellie replied. She took a deep breath.
So, you're not going to believe this.
What?
Remember that really rude guy I was telling you about that lived down the hall from you?
Yeah?
He died yesterday.
No, Edgar said in an astonished voice.
Like, I know I should feel bad, but...
That guy was a creep though, huh?
Replied Edgar.
Yeah. So anyway, that's why I'm early.
You wouldn't believe how many people I've seen pass away since I've been here. I guess I just get to enjoy you a little bit longer today now, that's all.
So, what needs done?
Ellie asked.
And maybe just some laundry. Oh, and I've been craving your tacos lately.
Ellie began loading Edgar's washing machine. He picked up his guitar and ran his fingertips down the strings.
You know I can play other music too, like your oldies.
I love oldies. They remind me of the car shows my dad used to take us to.
Edgar's face lit up.
That's cool.
He began strumming I'm Your Puppet. He then started in on the opening verse.
Pull the string and I'll wink at you. I'm your puppet.
Ellie stopped what she was doing and walked into the living room. She stood captivated, listening with her arms crossed. After Edgar finished, he set his guitar down. She smiled and clapped her hands.
Wow, Eddie, that's so good. You're such a good guitar player.
Thanks. That was one of the ones I used to swoon the señoritas with.
He laughed. He wiped the salsa from his mouth as he ate the tacos that Ellie made for him.
This is so good. It reminds me of the street vendors in Mexico.
Have you been there before?
Ellie asked.
Both my parents were born there. We would visit there at least once or twice a year to see family. That's where I picked up playing mariachi.
Ellie noticed Edgar kept reaching to scratch his back.
Do you still go back and visit?
I still keep in contact with my family, but it's been years.
Edgar scratched his back madly.
Son of a bitch,
he snapped as he threw his napkin down.
That fucking nurse still hasn't brought me my scabies cream. Can't you ask him about it? Because I'm about ready to sue this place.
Ellie got a startled look on her face.
Yeah, I can mention it to Tim when I see him,
she said nervously. Edgar sighed as the angry expression wiped off his face. He rubbed his forehead.
I'm sorry for yelling like that.
He grinned and shook his head.
Listen, don't get old. But if you could say something for me, I'd really appreciate it.
Before she left that afternoon, Ellie swung by the nurse's station. Tim shuffled from side to side as he sorted through the packs of medication. She knocked on the door.
Hi, sorry to bother you. I know you're busy. I have a client, Edgar Zavala, who was itching pretty bad today from his scabies. And he mentioned that he was supposed to be getting some kind of cream or something.
Shit,
Tim exclaimed.
I got busy earlier and forgot to run it by his room. I'll get it to him before I leave today.
That evening, right as Ellie began to doze off in bed, her phone rang. She clumsily reached for it as Nathan rolled over next to her and wiped the sleep from his eyes. Her screen registered Edgar's name and number.
Hello?
She murmured.
Hi, it's Eddie. Sorry I know it's late, but I just wanted to apologize again for how I blew up in front of you today. I'm sorry you had to see that.
It's all right, Eddie. Sometimes we all have bad days.
A Virgin Mary candle softly flickered on Edgar's dresser, giving the room an incandescent glow. He sat next to it, using its light to examine his Bowie knife as he spoke to Ellie. The feel of its handle in his hand, the sharpness of its unforgiving blade. He had a cold and distant look in his eyes.
Okay. Apology accepted then, I guess,
Edgar said.
Apology accepted,
Ellie replied.
I'll see you on Monday then, Mirena.
All right.
An unsettling feeling crept over Ellie as she hung up.
Is everything okay? Nathan asked.
Yeah.
What was that all about?
Eddie wanted to apologize again for blowing up today. He called me Mirena. He usually doesn't call me that. I think that means my queen in Spanish.
Nathan sighed.
He was probably just happy that you were cool about it and maybe got excited. Has he said anything like that before?
He usually calls me Ita.
I wouldn't worry too much about it,
Nathan said as he kissed Ellie's cheek, then turned on his side. Ellie closed her eyes as she tried to go back to sleep. The next afternoon, Edgar sat in his living room watching TV when Ellie knocked at his door.
Hey, Eddie,
she said with somewhat less enthusiasm than usual.
Oh, hey, come on in. I was just thinking about you,
Edgar said as he waved her inside. Ellie sat her bag on the counter. He looked her deep in the eyes.
I missed you.
His speech and body language seemed different. It didn't feel harmless and endearing like before, but instead almost lustful. That same uneasy feeling returned inside Ellie. She tried to brush it off, though, telling herself that it was all just a misunderstanding on her part.
Well, I missed you too,
she replied with a jittery smile. Edgar's eyes got big.
Hey, would you mind putting that medicine on my back for me? It's hard for me to reach.
She hesitated.
Sure.
The truth was, at this point, she didn't know how to respond, and it seemed to be escalating into a situation that her training could never have prepared her for.
Okay, hold on,
Edgar said as he rushed down the hallway. Pretty soon, Angel Baby could be heard playing in the other room. He came back smiling.
I thought you might like a little music.
He handed the tube of medicated scabies cream to Ellie. He then removed his shirt and sat down in his chair, with his back facing her. A pimple-like rash that was oozing fluid covered his upper back and shoulders. Ellie winced at the sight but slipped on her gloves and took a deep breath. She squeezed out a glob of cream, then began carefully rubbing it in,
Dios mío!
Edgar cried out from the sting. Ellie looked repulsed during the whole thing. She was a caregiver but not a nurse, and this type of care was out of the scope of her regular responsibilities. During all this, the music continued playing in the background, only adding to the awkwardness that she already felt. Edgar suddenly turned and looked at her from the side.
He doesn't deserve you.
What? You could get in a lot of trouble for saying things like that to me, and honestly, you're starting to make me feel really uncomfortable.
I know you'll feel the same way. I can feel it when you look at me.
Ellie huffed and got out of her chair.
Okay, I'm done here. That's inappropriate and I'm leaving.
Wait, please don't leave. You're the only thing I look forward to every day. You give me purpose, and the older you get, the harder it becomes sometimes to find that.
Edgar looked pitiful as he sat with his shoulders hunched over, sulking. Ellie began to sympathize with him.
Listen, Eddie, I enjoy you as a client, but I think you misunderstood our relationship. You shouldn't be calling me Mirena or talking about my boyfriend like that. And when I gave you my number, it was for emergencies only, okay?
Edgar gently nodded. Ellie then packed up her supplies and left. He walked in front of the mirror and stared at his reflection.
I don't mind pretending for a while, if that's what she needs.
That evening, Ellie stood in front of her bathroom mirror fixing her hair. She and Nathan had planned a romantic dinner at Don Juan's Mexican restaurant. Although she managed to force a smile when needed, she seemed lost in thought for most of the night. "Okay, what's wrong?" Nathan asked. Ellie set her fork down and nervously adjusted her dress.
I had an incident with Eddie today.
Nathan took a sip of his beer and squinted attentively. "What kind of incident?"
He said that he missed me and that you didn't deserve me.
"What?" Nathan replied, flabbergasted.
I almost stormed out, but he looked so pathetic.
"I don't care how he looked. He shouldn't be saying that kind of stuff. Did you report him?"
No, I was stern with him, though. I told him that it was inappropriate and not to talk about you or say stuff like that again.
Nathan shook his head. "I don't know about this guy, Ellie. I was trying to give him the benefit of the doubt, but that's totally inappropriate."
Well, what do you want me to do? Do you think I should say something?
Nathan sighed. "When you confronted him about it, what did he do?"
He just nodded his head. I just feel bad getting him into trouble. He's old and alone.
"Well, if he says anything else, you should report him, okay?" Ellie nodded and reached across the table to clutch Nathan's hand. On the car ride home, Ellie heard her text message alert. She reached inside her purse and grabbed her phone. As she clicked on the screen, her heart dropped. It was an audio recording from Edgar. She turned to Nathan.
You're not going to believe this. It's a message from Eddie.
She hit the play button.
"Hi, darling, it's Eddie. I know you said not to call unless it's an emergency, so I left you a message instead. I wrote you a song today. I know it probably won't sound as good on the phone, but here it goes."
A beautiful mariachi riff could then be heard playing. Edgar began to sing the words that he had penned out to express the dark and delusional fantasies that his mind had constructed. Nathan's mouth hung open. Ellie had a look of dread on her face. After the song ended, he continued.
"I hope you like it. Soon we'll be together, and everything will be like it was. Sweet dreams."
Nathan exploded like an inferno.
"I'm gonna call that son of a bitch back,"
he said, reaching for Ellie's phone.
No!
Ellie exclaimed, trying to calm him down.
I'll just block him and show this to Charles tomorrow. I don't think that calling and threatening him is gonna make things better.
Nathan paused.
"Okay, but if he keeps this up or tries anything with you while you're at work,"
he said as he raised his eyebrow. Ellie knew what that meant. Nathan grew up fighting and was a former junior Golden Gloves boxing champion. There was a time when he enjoyed hurting people, but that time had since passed. She knew, though, that he was more than capable of defending her if it came down to it. The next day, Ellie knocked on the window of Charles's office. He waved her inside. "What's up?" he said cheerfully. She looked unsure of herself as she trembled inside.
"I've been having an issue with one of my clients, Edgar Zavala."
Charles got an uncomfortable look on his face.
What kind of issue?
Well, it started with him calling me names like my queen and saying things like my boyfriend didn't deserve me. So I corrected him and explained that saying things like that was inappropriate. I thought that he understood, but then I got this message from him last night.
Ellie played the recording that Edgar had left for her. After it finished, Charles sat back in his chair and crossed his arms.
Well, sounds like quite the musician.
He sighed.
As a caregiver, you're probably going to hear things from some of your clients from time to time that don't always seem rational. Some can even come across as brash or vulgar. Many of the residents here are dealing with dementia or other forms of cognitive decline. I'm not trying to downplay what you're telling me. I'm just trying to remind you of where you're at.
Charles leaned forward onto his desk.
You do realize that it's against policy to give your information out to clients, right?
I realize I messed up by doing that, but
Ellie frowned.
This wasn't like an angry or emotional outburst. It's more like an infatuation that he has with me.
Charles leaned back.
We'll talk with Edgar. Are you wanting me to remove him from your workload?
Ellie nodded.
Yeah.
All right,
Charles replied, sounding somewhat vexed. Ellie called Nathan after she left.
That was so fucked up.
What was?
Nathan replied.
The way Charles basically talked to me like I was a child.
What?
Yeah, he acted like I was just overreacting.
What an asshole. Even after you played the message that he left?
He just tried to turn it around on me. He said that it was against the rules to give out your information, which I acknowledged, but it still doesn't give someone the right to act all creepy like that.
Ellie sighed.
But the good news is, he dropped Eddie as my client, so at least I don't have to see him anymore.
Nathan sighed a breath of relief.
Good.
That evening, Nathan looked over Edgar's Facebook page as he tried to get a better understanding of who they were dealing with. His picture was of an old photo of himself in his mariachi outfit. Most of his friends were women from overseas, and he only had a handful of posts, with many being YouTube videos of music performances by bands from Latin America.
Oh shit,
Nathan suddenly blurted out.
Ellie,
he exclaimed.
In here,
she replied as she painted her toenails in their bedroom. Nathan came sprinting into the room.
Check this out,
he said as he handed her his phone. Ellie looked at Edgar's about info. Under his relationship status, it read, married to Ellie Gutierrez since May 17th, 2023. The date was May 26th. Ellie's brow crinkled with dismay.
Are you serious?
Nathan hung his head in frustration, then looked back up.
Listen, just watch yourself around this guy, and if he says something to you, tell someone, okay?
Nathan hugged Ellie as she buried her head into his chest.
If he even thinks of trying anything, I'll fucking bury him.
Edgar sat in his living room watching Family Feud when he heard a loud knock at the door. He jumped up and grabbed a bouquet of roses off the kitchen counter that he had gotten for Ellie. However, it wasn't Ellie that showed up, but instead a young man with brown wavy hair and glasses.
Are you...
The young man paused as he looked down at his clipboard.
Edgar?
Edgar scowled.
Yeah, who are you? I'm Jason. I'll be starting as your new caregiver.
Edgar looked out into the hallway, as if he expected Ellie to still show up.
Where's Ellie?
I actually don't even know who that is. Today's only my second day working here.
Edgar sat the roses down and picked up his phone to call the front desk.
Hi, this is Edgar Zavala in room 201. They sent the wrong caregiver today. I'm supposed to be assigned to Ellie.
Hold on a minute.
Sylvia, who was the receptionist, replied as she typed at her computer. There was a long pause.
Charles must not have contacted you. Looks like you've been reassigned to Jason.
Edgar began shaking his head.
No one told me anything. There must be some kind of mix-up or something.
No, it's showing right here. Edgar Zavala, Jason Hansen, Wednesday, March 27th at 1:30.
So is there a chance she'll be back on Friday?
No, like I said, you've been assigned to Jason now, Mr. Zavala. He's your new caregiver.
Edgar hung up the phone, staring blankly into space. Jason sat his clipboard on the counter. So I have a checklist of chores that I'm supposed to do. Edgar stayed quiet as he checked off what needed to be done. When he was finished, Jason looked it over. Okay, I'll get started with doing some dishes then, if that's all right. Edgar nodded, then went back to watching TV. The sound of the pots and pans clanging around in the sink echoed torturously in his head. He tried calling Ellie again, but like all the other times before, it went straight to her voicemail. Jason rambled on incessantly. I know how it is when you get attached to someone. Sometimes you just gotta let go, though. Helping people like you that can't care for themselves really gets me through tough times. Jason scrubbed one of the pans furiously. You know, you really should lower the temperature on your stove when you're cooking. Otherwise, it causes burnt-on grease. Edgar walked into the kitchen and interrupted.
How about you just make me a sandwich?
Jason set the pan down. Sure, what do you want? I can make a mean Reuben. I can also do a club or a patty melt.
Grilled cheese is fine.
Jason toasted some bread, threw on a few slices of cheddar, then heated it up in the microwave. You got any tomato soup? Because that goes real well with grilled cheese. Edgar just stood there smoldering like a wildfire.
I don't want any pinchy soup. I just want a grilled cheese.
Jason got quiet as Edgar's eyes dug into him like daggers. The microwave beeped unnervingly when it finished cooking. Here's your sandwich, Jason said as he took it out of the microwave and sat it on the table. Edgar sat down, then held the sandwich to his mouth and took a bite. His brow furrowed and he spit it back out.
Chingao! This tastes like rubber.
Jason nervously opened the refrigerator and began digging around. I can make you something else. It looks like there's some ground beef, something else that looks kind of like chili beans. Edgar got up from where he was sitting and walked over to the stove as Jason continued looking through the refrigerator. He grabbed the cast iron comal that was sitting on the burner. He then snuck up on Jason from behind, striking him over the head with it and sending him crashing into the refrigerator shelves as food tumbled out. Edgar threw the comal in the sink and walked back over to him. He grabbed the back of his hair and dragged his body onto the floor. Jason lay sprawled out on his belly with the back of his head split open. Blood soon began to drench his hair, changing its color from a light brown to a deep, soggy auburn. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. Edgar jerked his head up to look. It was the old man that lived in the room next to him. He stood out in the hallway in his robe.
Hey, you okay in there?
Edgar quickly thought up an excuse.
I'm fine, just moving some furniture.
The old man crankily threw his arm in the air.
All right, just keep it down. I'm trying to watch Judge Judy.
He mumbled as he turned and walked away. Jason started groaning as he slowly began to regain consciousness. Edgar walked into the other room, then returned a few moments later holding a guitar string in his hand. He crouched down, planting his knee into the small of Jason's back, then wrapped the string around his throat. He gritted his teeth, pulling on it with such force that his hands began to shake. Jason's head lifted off the ground as the string dug fiercely into his throat, eventually tearing the skin and causing blood to ooze out. Edgar finally released the tension when he was sure he was dead.
Nos vemos en el infierno,
he growled as he stood back up. Several hours later, Sylvia got a call from one of Jason's other clients. After she hung up, she turned to Charles.
Did Jason leave early today?
Not to my knowledge, Charles responded. He pulled up the time clock. It shows him still clocked in. Sylvia got a baffled look on her face.
That's strange. I just got a call from one of his clients saying that he was supposed to have been at his room 40 minutes ago, and he never showed up.
Well, I know he was here earlier. Who was his first client? She double-clicked her mouse.
Looks like it was Edgar Zavala.
She then paused thoughtfully.
You know, now that I think of it, I remember Zavala calling me earlier because he was upset his caregiver was changed.
What room's he in?
201.
I'll run down there and see if he's still in there for some reason. Charles knocked on Edgar's door. There was no answer, so he knocked again, this time pressing his ear up to it. There was no sound that he could hear. As he was about to turn and leave, he suddenly heard the deadbolt release. The door slowly cracked open and Edgar answered.
Can I help you, sir?
He said politely. Hello, Mr. Zavala?
Yeah?
I'm Charles. I'm the director here. He paused. Did Jason ever make it over today?
Yeah, he was here earlier.
Edgar smiled.
Great kid, by the way.
When did he leave? Edgar stroked his mustache.
Maybe about an hour ago.
Did he by chance say where he was going?
No, not that I recall. Is everything okay?
Yeah, we're just trying to locate him. Charles peered over Edgar's shoulder into his room. Edgar turned to the side.
Did you want to come in?
Charles sighed and put his hand on his hip. No, he probably just went to lunch or something and didn't say anything. I'll keep checking around.
Okay.
Edgar smiled darkly as he slowly pushed the door closed. Can you pull up the cameras for me? Charles asked Sylvia. Zavala told me that Jason left his room about an hour ago. The two studied camera footage for the next few minutes. The video recording showed Jason entering Edgar's room at 1:27, but it never showed him leaving. Charles got a perplexed look on his face.
Fuck,
he whispered under his breath. He shook his head.
That doesn't make any sense. I guess I'll be heading back over there.
He made his way back to Edgar's room and knocked on his door. The gentle banging broke the uneasy stillness that seemed to fill the hallway. There was no response, so he knocked once more and called out his name. Mr. Zavala, it's Charles. I just need to talk to you again. He waited a few more seconds, then pulled a giant key set from his pants pocket. He inserted the master key, and with a turn of his wrist, the deadbolt slid back into its chamber, and the door opened. He could hear the TV, but there was no sign of anyone inside.
Hello?
He called out as he cautiously entered. Mr. Zavala? Jason? He walked slowly as he scanned the room. A framed photograph that sat atop an end table caught his eye. He bent over to examine it. His eyes suddenly opened wide, and he snatched it in his hand to get a closer look. In the photograph, Edgar stood with his arm around a woman. A crude cutout of Ellie's face was plastered onto her body. Charles grimaced as a sick feeling came over him. He sat it back down and continued into the kitchen. Edgar had cleaned everything up. The grilled cheese sandwich with the bite taken out of it still sat on the counter. As he continued into the bedroom, there were several more photos that were carefully placed on the dresser. One was of Edgar and the Mariachi band that he played with, posing together as a group. The next one was a white 1960 Chevrolet El Camino. The last one was of presumably the same woman that Charles had seen in the photo in the other room. She stood next to Edgar, dressed in a wedding gown and holding a bouquet of flowers. Edgar was dressed in a black charro suit. Another cutout of Ellie's face was superimposed onto her body. A chill ran down Charles's spine.
What the fuck?
He muttered to himself. He bent down and checked under the bed, then turned the light on in the bathroom, but there was still no sign of Jason. He finally came upon a small storage closet. He tried the handle, but the door seemed wedged shut. He grunted, then jerked on it, finally forcing it open. Jason's battered corpse fell out onto the floor. Charles's expression morphed into one of sheer terror. He shrieked and stumbled backwards, then darted out of the room. He sprinted through the hallway and into the lobby. He tried to open the office door, but he was so riddled with adrenaline that his fingers fumbled the keys, and he dropped him on the ground. Sylvia jumped up from her seat and opened the door.
What's wrong?
He's dead. Call the police.
Charles exclaimed as he began to hyperventilate.
Who's dead?
Just do it.
Many of the clients that stood in the lobby began to whisper amongst themselves as they watched the chaos. Sylvia picked up the phone and dialed 911. A short time later, numerous police and medical personnel began entering the building. Charles had managed to gather himself enough to relay a basic account of what had happened.
Okay, what's going on?
Sergeant Harris barked.
I discovered the dead body of one of our caregivers,
Charles said, still trembling.
Where? Room 201.
Harris then turned and hollered.
Let's get this place locked down. No one in, no one out.
He turned to Sylvia, as Charles was too incapacitated.
Can you have your employees begin getting everyone back in their rooms?
Sylvia nodded, then bolted into action. As police began sweeping the area, they couldn't help but notice some of the clients, many of whom were shut-ins, and had long since been forgotten about by the outside world. An old man in a wheelchair sat in the corner, mindlessly mumbling to himself. Another woman appeared frozen in an odd, crippled position from lack of movement. She followed them with her eyes as they scrambled around.
Police, we're coming in,
Harris announced as he drew his gun from his holster. He entered Edgar's room, followed closely behind by several other officers. They began methodically searching the area.
Over here,
an officer called out as he caught a glimpse of Jason's tennis shoes from around the corner.
Get some paramedics in here,
Harris cried out. An EMT quickly rushed in, crouching down next to Jason as he checked for a pulse. He then shook his head despairingly, as Jason had long since expired. That evening, Ellie was exercising on her elliptical when her phone rang. She answered, putting it on speaker.
Oh my God, I'm so glad you're okay.
Her friend Marissa exclaimed.
Why wouldn't I be okay?
Ellie replied with a confused grin.
It just said on the news that Lakeside was on lockdown because a staff there got killed.
Ellie almost fell off the elliptical. She stepped off it and grabbed her phone, taking it off speaker.
What? Check KRDO News. It's on right now.
Ellie turned on the news and saw a reporter who was standing in the parking lot of Lakeside. Again, Lakeside Assisted Living was placed on lockdown after the body of one of their caregivers was found dead inside one of the rooms. No further details are being released by police at this time, but News 13 will continue to follow this story as it develops. Danny Trujillo, News 13, the reporter said somberly. Ellie took the phone away from her ear and placed her hand over her mouth in shock. Edgar, she thought to herself, even before she knew what had happened. She slowly raised the phone back to her ear and gasped.
I gotta call you back. I can't talk right now, Marissa. I'm sorry.
She watched the rest of the news broadcast as she stared anxiously at the TV screen. After it ended, she picked up her phone and called the facility. Sylvia answered.
Lakeside. It's Ellie. It wasn't him, was it, Edgar?
Sylvia let out a guarded sigh.
Listen, honey. I can't say anything right now over the phone, but I'm sure you'll find out soon enough. I'm just glad you're okay.
A tear rolled down Ellie's cheek. The tone of Sylvia's voice was enough to confirm what she had feared.
Can you at least tell me if they got him?
She whispered with choking heaviness. Sylvia paused.
I'm sorry.
Nathan rushed home from work after Ellie called him. He burst through the door, locking the deadbolt behind him. Ellie was sitting on the couch. He sat down next to her, wrapping his arms around her.
I'm sorry,
he said.
I still haven't heard for sure if it was Eddie that did it, but I got a really bad feeling, babe.
Nathan wiped the tears from her face.
Just wait till tomorrow. When you go back to work, I'm sure you'll find out more.
I don't know if I want to go back. I don't know if I can.
Ellie prepared breakfast the next morning when her phone rang.
Hello, is this Ellie Gutierrez?
A gravelly voice asked.
This is her.
This is Detective Clemens with the Pueblo PD. Would you be available this afternoon to come down to the station for questioning?
Well, I have to work at 11.
Don't worry about that right now. We've been in contact with your employer.
He sighed.
In case you haven't already heard, there was a homicide that occurred yesterday at your workplace. We also have a suspect who's still at large.
I heard about it on the news yesterday. I can be there around 11:30 if that's okay.
That works perfect. Just come on in through the main entrance off Grand Avenue and ask for Detective Clemens.
Before Ellie arrived at the station, Clemens drove over to Edgar's sister's mobile home. He knocked on the door and was soon greeted by an aggressive 85-pound German shepherd that jumped on the screen and began barking wildly. Clemens jumped back.
Jesus!
Vivian stared at him as her dog continued barking.
Hello, ma'am. I'm Detective Clemens with the Pueblo PD. Are you Vivian Zavala?
She nodded.
Can I just get a quick moment of your time?
Vivian yanked on the dog's collar, subduing him long enough to slam the door. Clemens got a frustrated look on his face.
It's about your brother. It'll only take a minute,
he exclaimed as he stood on her steps. Pretty soon the door opened again, and to his relief, the dog was pinned up.
I ain't got all day,
Vivian said as she opened the screen door.
Hurry up, otherwise you'll let all the flies in.
Thank you,
Clemens said as he hustled inside. He sat down next to her at the dining room table.
Ms. Zavala, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but yesterday there was a homicide that occurred in the room where your brother lived, and now he's missing.
Vivian frowned numbly and shook her head.
I'm not here to point the finger of blame on him. We just want to locate him and ask him a few questions. I was hoping that maybe you could tell me a little more about Edgar and where he might be.
Vivian slowly turned her head toward the detective. The sunlight shined through the window on her haggard face.
Well, it doesn't surprise me, and he ain't here if that's what you're wondering. When he was first released from the psychiatric hospital, he wanted to stay here, and I flat out refused. Then the state put him up in that nursing home. I knew that was a mistake from the start.
Edgar was committed to a psychiatric hospital?
Vivian nodded stiffly.
He was in the Colorado Mental Health Institute for 28 years. It was the only time I ever had peace of mind.
Why was he in there?
She sighed.
He killed Gloria, his wife. The court found him not guilty by reason of insanity. As heinous as it was, I didn't think he'd ever see the light of day again, but I guess the psychiatrist thought differently. They put him in this program, a community release type program. He was supposed to check in monthly with his caseworker. He was also put on medication, but he told me that he quit taking it a few months ago. I tried to call the hospital several times to tell them, but they told me that if nothing was noted by the nurse, they couldn't do anything about it.
How long ago was he discharged?
It was right around the beginning of the year, so about 5 months ago.
Do you think him not taking his medication could have led to a violent outburst?
Vivian chuckled ominously.
I would still like to have a frank conversation with the doctor that signed off on his release. I've seen how Eddie gets without his meds. The delusions, the obsessions. My brother can be whoever you want him to be, or whoever it benefits him to be. He can be charming. He can be funny, and then he can be someone that you pray you never meet in your life. I think that's why it took them 40 years to finally catch him.
Well, that's pretty alarming,
Clemens responded.
Do you have any idea where he might have fled to?
That's your job, detective. I said to myself I'd give him one more chance. But now he burnt all his bridges here. But if you do catch him, let me know. Because I'd love to be there for his execution.
Clemens finished scribbling in his notepad and pulled his business card from his shirt pocket.
Listen, if he shows up here, call the police. And if you can think of anything else, my number's on the card. Thank you for your time today, ma'am.
Ellie sat in the police station waiting room in a daze.
Ms. Gutierrez?
Clemens said as he walked up to her. She jumped.
I didn't mean to startle you. I'm Detective Clemens,
he said as he extended his hand.
Thanks for coming in.
Ellie shook his hand and followed him into a small room, just large enough to accommodate the desk and chairs that filled it.
Are you thirsty?
He asked, holding a pitcher of water in his hand.
No,
Ellie replied. Clemens sat the pitcher down.
So I called you down here today to maybe help us with a case. Yesterday, the body of one of your co-workers was found dead inside Edgar Zavala's room. I understand that he was a former client of yours.
Ellie nodded and put her head in her hands as she began to weep.
You can take a minute if you need to,
Clemens said, setting a box of tissues next to her. She grabbed a tissue and wiped the tears from her eyes.
When I heard what had happened yesterday on the news, I knew it was him,
she whimpered.
So, what made you drop Edgar as your client?
It just got awkward. It started with him calling me names like my queen, and he would say things like my boyfriend didn't deserve me. Then he recorded this weird-ass song.
Did you still have it?
Yeah,
replied Ellie as she reached for her phone. She hit the play button and sat her phone on the desk. After it finished, Clemens shook his head.
Did you show that to your supervisor?
Yeah, and I also blocked his number.
When we were searching Edgar's room, we discovered several altered photos. They contained cutouts of your face that were pasted onto another woman's body, possibly his late wife.
Ellie shuddered.
What?
Clemens gestured with his hand.
I'm not trying to scare you, but you might want to be a little extra cautious until we can locate Edgar and bring him into custody.
Well, am I going to get like some kind of protection?
I was told that the sheriff's department has increased the number of patrols down your street. We'll be exhausting all our resources to catch this guy, but I could use your help.
Ellie looked up at Clemens.
How?
You said you blocked him, right? His telephone number and social media?
Ellie nodded.
If you were to unblock him, there's a chance he might try and contact you again. He may even want to meet up with you. If so, we can take any information that he gives you and launch a sting operation.
Ellie got a dubious look on her face.
So, what you're saying is you want to use me as bait?
It's totally up to you, but your assistance could be a huge asset to us.
Ellie crossed her arms as she pondered the detective's proposition.
I need to talk to my boyfriend first, but this involves him too.
Absolutely.
Clemens reached into his shirt pocket.
Here's my card. Not to rush you, but in cases like this, timing is critical. So if you could call me as soon as possible, I'd appreciate it.
Ellie nodded, stony-eyed. He wants you to meet up with this guy? Nathan exclaimed. Ellie, he just murdered someone.
I know. That's all I've been thinking about since yesterday. I couldn't even sleep last night because I was worried about him breaking in here and...
She began to blubber.
Fucking raping me or killing me.
I'm not going to let that happen. And if he does break in here, I swear on my grandma's grave, his old ass is leaving in a body bag.
But you can't always be here.
Ellie paused.
What if it's some other young girl he goes after next?
So what are you thinking?
Nathan asked. A boldness seemed to come over Ellie.
I can either do nothing and live in fear, or I can try and help get him.
Nathan froze in silence, and although he was apprehensive, it seemed that Ellie had already made up her mind. A little while later, she called Detective Clemens to inform him that she would agree to unblock Edgar's number. He then proceeded to give her detailed instructions on what to say if Edgar happened to call or text her. He also assured her that she had little to worry about, as her safety was their main priority. It would be a carefully coordinated operation under the direct supervision of undercover agents. Surveillance cameras would be placed around the property in case Edgar showed up unannounced. Several days had passed with no breaks in the case. Edgar's whereabouts remained unknown, and Nathan and Ellie remained on edge. She now almost instinctively jumped every time the phone rang or her text message alert chimed. Usually it was either family or friends checking in on her. The third evening, she got a text from Marissa.
Hey friend, what are you up to?
Marissa wrote.
Nothing much, just trying to decide what to fix for dinner. You want to come hang out for a bit? I'm about to order pizza. No, just not feeling it tonight, but thanks. Come on, you can't stay trapped in that place forever.
Ellie thought about it for a minute. She looked over at Nathan, who was playing video games.
Marissa's ordering pizza tonight and she invited me over. I told her I didn't think I was up for it yet.
Nathan paused his game. It might help you get your mind off things. He shrugged his shoulders. It's better than sitting around here and dwelling on shit.
I think I just feel depressed.
Ellie sighed and smiled with resolve.
You're probably right. Be over in a minute. Save me a slice.
She texted Marissa.
LOL. Make it snappy.
She replied. Darkness moved in, discreetly yet undeterred. Nathan walked Ellie out to her car as a precaution. The moon shined with a deathly paleness in the night sky as she drove to Marissa's house. She turned on the radio. Mariachi music began blaring from the speakers, but she quickly changed the station as she didn't want any reminders of Edgar. She put on some hip-hop and gently patted her hand on the steering wheel. When she pulled into Marissa's driveway, her car was parked outside, and the porch light was on. Ellie parked and went and knocked on the door. No one answered, so she tried the handle. The door was open, so she let herself in. The living room was dark, but she could see light shining from the kitchen. You shouldn't really leave your door unlocked. There's a bunch of creeps around here, Ellie called out. Suddenly, Edgar stepped out of the shadows from behind her. Before she had a chance to scream, he placed his hand over her mouth and held his Bowie knife up to her throat. Don't worry, I'll protect you, he whispered in her ear. She could feel the blade as it pressed against her skin. She dropped her purse and cried out as she tried to escape his grip. Edgar had learned through viewing Ellie's Facebook that Marissa was her best friend. He did a Google search and was able to find her home address. After fleeing from the assisted living facility, he cased her residence until he gained entry into her home through a small window that he pried open. While hiding out in her basement, he was able to listen to the women's conversations. He learned of the sting operation, and he knew that the only way to get to Ellie was through someone close to her, someone like Marissa. Don't tense up. Don't fight it. Edgar pushed Ellie through the living room and then the kitchen. She began to see blood trails and smeared handprints and thick blood on the walls and countertops, suggesting that a violent struggle had taken place. Downstairs, he commanded. He escorted her down the stairs, step by step, with the knife still resting firmly against her trachea. Halfway down the flight of stairs, she got her first glimpse of the carnage that awaited her. And when they reached the bottom, she witnessed the depths of Edgar's derangement. Marissa's corpse was propped up in a chair. Her throat was cut so deep that her head remained attached to her body only by a few strands of connective tissue. On the table next to her were 2 wedding rings sitting in their boxes. The same rings that Edgar and his deceased wife had once wore when they were married. Ellen's legs buckled and then she fell to her knees as she began to sob. Edgar got her back up and continued walking her to an empty seat across from Marissa. He ordered her to sit down, then reached for some duct tape that he had in his back pocket. He taped her mouth shut, then bound her hands behind her back and her legs to the chair. With Ellie now restrained, Edgar placed his knife back into its sheath that was attached to his belt. He smiled giddily. I have to run upstairs, mi amor, but I'll be right back.
This'll give you and Marissa a chance to catch up on some girl talk.
He cocked his head to the side and gazed at her.
You look so beautiful.
Edgar then sprinted back upstairs. He grabbed a large cabinet and began strenuously dragging it towards the front door to barricade it shut. While he was upstairs, Ellie began wiggling her arms and legs as she tried desperately to free herself. She looked around the room and noticed the steel beams that provided support for the house's foundation. They were square in shape and had jagged edges. She began jerking her body, using the momentum to inch the chair toward one of the beams that stood about 5 feet away from her. With her chair backed up against the beam, she used its edge to saw through the tape. After Edgar finished moving the cabinet, he ran back downstairs. The smile quickly wiped off his face when he discovered that Ellie was no longer sitting in her chair. He looked around when she suddenly jumped out from hiding behind the staircase and smashed his guitar across his face. The blow to the head sent him stumbling sideways. Ellie then bolted up the stairs. When he regained his senses, he pulled his knife from its sheath.
Must have cold feet,
he uttered to himself as he took off after her. Ellie grimaced when she saw the cabinet that was blocking the front door. She continued running through the house looking for an escape route. She turned another corner and discovered a love seat that Edgar had placed in front of the door that led into the garage.
Fuck!
She said hysterically. She continued to the upstairs as Edgar followed from a distance. Marissa lived alone, and Ellie remembered that her father bought her a handgun for protection that she kept hidden in her closet. And Marissa's father, being a bit overprotective, wanted to make sure that his daughter was more than adequately armed. It was a Smith & Wesson .44 Magnum, a handgun suited more for hunting big game than merely defending yourself against a home intruder. She burst into the bedroom and locked the door. A few seconds later, Edgar stopped in front of it and tried the handle but saw that it was locked. Ellie dug through Marissa's closet as she frantically searched for the gun. Edgar banged on the door. A trickle of blood ran from his earlobe from the guitar blow that he took to the face.
Ellie, don't be like this.
Just leave me alone,
she pleaded.
Ellie,
he yelled as he hit the door again. She finally came across a hard plastic case that was buried under some clothes. She undid the clips and removed the gun from its interior compartment. As she checked its cylinder, she saw that it was fully loaded and breathed a momentary sigh of relief. On the other side of the door, Edgar grinned with amusement and began tossing his knife from one hand to another while letting out a low, demented chuckle. He then grabbed the weapon with both hands. His eyes widened and he grunted savagely as he began stabbing the blade through the door's panels. Ellie stood in the corner, aiming the gun in his direction. After numerous puncture holes, Edgar was finally able to punch through the door and let himself in. He saw Ellie wielding the revolver and stopped just past the doorway's threshold. He stood there, breathing heavily with his eyes transfixed on her.
You gonna shoot me? You want me dead?
Ellie cocked the gun's hammer.
Stay back, or I swear to God I'll do it.
Edgar then scowled menacingly.
I've been dead for years,
he hissed as he took a step forward. With her adrenaline surging, she unleashed a hail of gunfire, emptying all 6 rounds into his body. The concussion from each bullet blew portions of his shirt open and left behind mangled, gaping exit wounds. The impact sent him stumbling backwards into the hallway and finally toppling over the banister. Ellie dropped the gun as smoke rose from the barrel. She then crept out into the hallway and peered over the railing at the floor below. Edgar lay sprawled out in a pool of blood. His left leg was bent in an unnatural position behind his body, as if it had been broken by the fall. Blood ran from the corners of his mouth, yet his eyes remained open, as if staring into the unknown. She gasped and turned her head, then bravely began her descent down the stairs. When she got to the bottom of the steps, she cringed as she was forced to walk through the blood that had saturated the ground where Edgar lay. Her purse sat in the living room where she had dropped it. She used all her strength and was able to move the cabinet far enough away from the door to slide past it. She dialed 911, then waited outside, cold and alone in the darkness. 3 months later. Although her life was spared, the guilt and turmoil that Ellie felt following the events of that night was crippling. The feelings of fear and loss of self-control had caused her to avoid going out in public. But with the advice of her therapist and the support of Nathan, she gradually began venturing out into the world again. The day of her birthday, Nathan took her out to eat at Don Juan's restaurant. He held her hand as he gazed deeply into her eyes. "I'm proud of you and the strength that you've shown over these last few months." Ellie sighed.
It hasn't been easy. I just hope this next year's better than the last.
Suddenly an announcement came over the restaurant's PA system.
"Attention, everyone. We have a special young lady who's celebrating her birthday with us today. If you could all please put your hands together for Ellie."
She smiled and looked over at Nathan.
Did you do this?
He looked back at her and grinned. Pretty soon, singing could be heard. A violin then followed, along with a horn and a guitar in unison. A group of mariachi players then filed into the center of the restaurant. Ellie let out a shriek and her face twisted with dread. She covered her eyes and turned away. Nathan quickly got up from his seat and rushed over to sit next to her.
Baby, what's wrong?"
He began waving his hands in the air.
"Stop the music!"
He then rose to his feet.
"Stop the music!"
he pleaded. The men abruptly quit singing and the smiles faded from the room. Ellie took her hands away from her face and looked back at the mariachi players. She initially believed in her mind that she had seen Edgar's face. In reality, though, it was just a man who bore a strong resemblance to him.
I thought it was him,
she uttered tearfully.
"You're safe. Just breathe,"
Nathan said calmly.
"Remember the techniques you learned."
It seemed a reminder of Edgar could be found everywhere. He was the man in line with his head turned, or the person sitting several rows up in church, or even that stranger rushing by in the distance at a busy airport. His memory was forever archived in Ellie's mind, and she prayed that one day she wouldn't see his face when she dreamed.
"What's eating you?" the bartender asked. He wiped the bar with a rag, lifting napkin holders and bowls of peanuts so he could clean under them. The neon beer signs hanging overhead cast soft-edged splashes of color down onto the reflective wetness of the bar top. He waved at the last group of patrons as they pulled on their jackets and exited the bar. "Good night," he called after them. It was almost closing time. "Fucking Michelson, that's what," Lewis said. He hunched over a glass of whiskey, watching the ice melt into colorless swirls in the amber liquid. He tapped the base of his ring finger silently against the glass. Lewis was a short, overweight man with a sullen scowl that carved deep lines from the corners of his mouth down toward where his chin merged with his neck. His crew cut did little to conceal the patchy baldness spreading across his scalp. A roll of skin on the back of his neck prickled with short, stubbly hair. His tie hung loose and crooked around his unbuttoned collar, the weight of his belly pressed against his thighs. "Him again, huh?" The bartender dried his hands on his apron. You bet your ass him again. Lewis thumped his fist on the bar, causing the pint glasses stacked in front of him to clink together. The bartender reached out and steadied them. What is it this time? Lewis groaned and massaged his temples as if trying to crush the memory out of existence. He blew out a sour breath, then opened his eyes. Okay, you know what the real estate market's like these days, right? Pretty bad, right? Really fucking bad. Lewis grabbed a handful of peanuts from the small metal bowl on the bar and swirled them around in his hand. He popped a few in his mouth, then continued as he chewed. So, there's this couple. Been working on him forever. Months. They've been out to see the unit 3-4 times already. Can't make up their goddamned minds. But finally, today, I get them to bite. They say they'll take it. Hey, that's great, right? That's good news. Fuck yeah, it is. Until... Lewis laughed bitterly, then took a sip of whiskey from his glass. Fucking Michelson. What do you do? I come back to the office. I've got the contract in hand, signed, holding it up like this. Lewis picked up a handful of bar napkins and held them aloft, showing them off to an imaginary crowd. It's a big deal. Huge. 7 figures. I slammed the papers down on my boss's desk. He slapped the napkins down on the bar to illustrate. I say, sold. Fuck you. Pay me. The bartender raised his eyebrows in surprise. You said that? Lewis shrugged. Yeah, it's all good. We're friends. Besides, there's this contest. He put out a bounty to break the curse and motivate us. The next person to sell a unit gets an extra 1% commission, which, on a 7-figure deal, that's a nice little bonus. Hell yeah, it is. So, what's the problem? What's the problem? Fucking Michelson, that's the problem. Lewis took another sip of his whiskey, wincing as it went down. He sucked in air through his teeth to cool his burning throat. He tapped the rim of his mostly empty glass, signaling for a refill. As the bartender poured another shot, Lewis pressed on with the story. So I say, fuck you, pay me. And my boss starts laughing. Everyone else starts laughing too, but, like, at me. I get this feeling in my stomach, like, oh no, here we go again. So I look around. Spot Michelson. He holds up a contract like this in one hand. Lewis picked up a handful of napkins and held them up. Then, like this, in the other. He picked up a second pile of napkins in his other hand and held that up too. He beat you to it. Not once, Lewis said, letting one pile of napkins fall from his hand. But twice. He let go of the other pile. The napkins fluttered to the floor. 2 units. 2 units. 2 goddamned units. On the same day. On the same goddamn day. The bartender whistled. That's some luck. Isn't it? Lewis took a gulp of his whiskey. Fucking Michelson. Lewis stared into his drink with a faraway look, lost in thought. The bartender busied himself with rinsing some stemware that had been soaking in the sink. Finally, Lewis looked up. His eyes were glassy. You know what I don't get? Why 2? His voice was thick in his throat. Like, I get it. He beat me to it. Good for him. He sells 1, no problem. But 2? Why does he need 2? The guy's already got everything. Lewis tapped his ring finger absently against the glass. He sniffed. Give me that kind of luck for once, you know? Let me get 2. 1 for him, 2 for me. Is that too much to ask? It was a rhetorical question, but the bartender answered it anyway. Not at all. Lewis tossed back the last swallow of his whiskey, then placed the empty glass back on the bar. The bartender lifted the bottle of whiskey from the well and tilted it towards Lewis. "One more?" Lewis placed his hand over the glass and shook his head. "Nah, close my tab. I'm broke." "No worries," the bartender said. "I got this one." Lewis removed his hand from his glass and slid it towards the bartender. "In that case, make it a double." The bartender laughed. He filled the glass, then flipped a shot glass out from under the bar and filled that too. After dropping the whiskey bottle into the well, he picked up the shot and held it aloft in a toast. "To Michelson," he proclaimed. "May whatever luck comes to him come to you, ×2. "Amen," Lewis said as he clinked his glass with the bartender. "From your mouth to God's ears." Lewis hung up the phone and angrily scribbled a heavy line through another name on a typed list full of crossed-out names. Then he slammed the pen down on his desk and pushed the list away, disgusted. His chair creaked under his bulk as he leaned back and screwed his fists into his eyes. After a few seconds, he dropped his hands into his lap and stared at the ceiling. The fire sprinkler overhead peered down at him like a single blood-red eye. He wondered how big of a fire it would take to set the thing off. He pictured the flames licking up the walls, hungrily consuming the bulletin board full of real estate listings, the starburst-shaped sold stickers curling and blackening in the heat. He saw the Salesman of the Month award melting in its cheap acrylic frame, Dan Michelson's smug, smiling face bubbling and peeling as his photo disintegrated in the fire. A knocking sound broke Lewis out of his reverie. He sat up and reached for his pen, instinctively trying to look busy. One of the other salesmen, Duncan, was leaning into his cubicle. "You up for drinks tonight? Michelson's buying." A sour bolt of acid shot up the back of Lewis's throat. He swallowed it down. Fucking Michelson. "Not tonight." Lewis motioned to the list of names on his desk. "Lots of catching up to do." "Come on, who are you kidding? You're not that busy." Duncan laughed. "If Michelson's got time, anyone does." "Funny," Lewis said humorlessly. His lip curled into what he hoped was a smile. How nice for Michelson that he was able to take a break from being so goddamned perfect for a minute to lower himself to the rest of their level. Lewis suppressed the urge to flip his desk over. Instead, he said, "That's okay, I'm good." Duncan looked around furtively, then stepped into Lewis's cubicle and sat on the squat filing cabinet next to Lewis's desk. Lewis unconsciously wheeled his chair backward as Duncan leaned towards him and spoke with a lowered voice. "Listen, I know it's been hard since Rachel left. I get it. You want to shut down, stay inside, and say fuck the world. But that's the worst thing you can do. You need to get out there, have fun, and meet new people. It's been what, 6 months?" 7. Lewis looked down at his hands. His thumb traced lazy arcs around the smooth skin where his wedding ring used to be. 7 months. That's a long time. And you just made a big sale. You deserve to get out, cut loose a little bit. Put some of that fat commission check to good use. That fat commission check didn't even make a dent in what I owe. You know how much a divorce lawyer costs? Lewis wheeled his chair back up to his desk. He picked up the list of names. "Like I said, I'm busy." He picked up the phone and prepared to dial. "Okay." Duncan stood up. "You want me to make the hard sell? Here's the hard sell." He grabbed the back of Lewis's chair and pulled him away from the desk. Lewis dropped the phone. It dangled off the edge of the desk, spinning at the end of its cord near the floor. "Get your ass up, now." "Duncan, come on." "You want to get wheeled out of here in your chair?" Because I'll do it. You're fat, but I'll do it. Lewis sighed. Duncan wasn't going to give up, and he knew it. The guy was relentless. In sales, in life, in everything. All right, Lewis said. He slapped his hands on his thighs and reluctantly pressed himself to a standing position. I'm up. You happy? Good man. Saves me a visit to the chiropractor. Now, he slung his arm around Lewis's shoulders. You and I and the rest of the guys are going to have some drinks. Michelson's gonna pay, because fuck him. Then we're gonna head to the strip and win some money. And then we're gonna meet some ladies. You mean hookers? Duncan shrugged. You say potato. The point is, we'll have fun, whether you like it or not. Deal? Deal. Lewis sat at the outside edge of the corner booth, nursing a mostly empty beer. Duncan was beside him, rambling to the other guys at the table about something or other. Lewis wasn't listening. He was too busy watching Michelson while trying not to stare. Dan Michelson was Hollywood handsome with an NFL chin, the best salesman on the team by a long shot. He was charming and popular, the kind of guy who needed a snorkel to keep from drowning in pussy. To make matters worse, he was a pretty nice guy. He probably saved puppies from burning buildings on his days off, for fun. Lewis hated him. At the moment, Michelson was leaning on the bar, hitting on a hot blonde in skin-tight leather pants and a teal crop top. Or was she hitting on him? It was hard to tell. She was doing that coy thing where she'd laugh, then look down at the floor, push a strand of hair behind her ear, and then look up while biting her lower lip. Classic fuck me move. The blonde motioned to the bartender, then held up 2 fingers. The bartender handed her 2 bottles of beer. She gave one to Michelson. Christ almighty, Lewis thought. She's buying him a drink. Unfucking believable. Lewis had never had a woman offer to buy him a drink in his entire life. Not once. And he never would. If it didn't happen when he was Michelson's age, when he was younger and thinner and had plenty of hair, it certainly wasn't going to happen now, when he was middle-aged, fat, and balding. Don't forget you're broke, his inner voice reminded him. Right, he was broke, too. And yet there was Michelson, already blessed with every possible advantage in life, having one more thing handed to him. 2, if you counted the blonde. She might as well have a flashing neon "fuck me" sign around her neck. Lewis drained the rest of his beer, then added his bottle to the growing collection of empties in the center of the table. A waitress arrived at the table with a tray of fresh drinks, as if on cue. She was a short and perky brunette with crystal blue eyes. Her name tag read Shelby. "Another round, boys?" she said. "Courtesy of Captain America over there." The guys at the table cheered. Michelson looked over at them and laughed, raising his beer in salute. The waitress distributed the drinks, leaving Lewis for last. She placed a bottle in front of him. "Thanks," he mumbled, without looking up. The waitress touched his shoulder and leaned close to his ear. "You look like you could use another," she whispered. She set a second beer in front of him. Her manicured fingernails gently grazed his neck as she drew her hand away. Goosebumps rushed up his forearms and into his rolled shirt sleeves. Lewis looked up at her, confused. "What?" He looked down at the pair of beers before him, then up at her again. "No, I don't—" "Shh," she said. "It's on me." She tucked a folded cocktail napkin into Lewis's front shirt pocket, then turned and walked away without another word. Lewis watched her go. What the hell was that about? He wondered. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the napkin. Written on it in pink ballpoint pen were the words, "Find me after." It was signed, Shelby. The tail of the Y looped into a tiny heart at the end. Lewis looked up again, searching the bar for the waitress, but she was gone. Lewis slid out of the booth. His co-workers piled out after him. They were all wasted. Duncan fake-punched Lewis in the stomach as he stood. Lewis flinched. Duncan laughed. "Gotcha," he slurred. "You know it," Lewis said distractedly. He scanned the crowd, looking for the waitress who had slipped in the napkin. "Let's go win some money," Duncan said. "Casino! Go, go, go!" He nudged Lewis towards the exit. "We got room for one more?" a syrupy voice said from behind. "Amber says she's feeling lucky." Lewis looked over his shoulder. It was Michelson. He towered over Lewis by a good 6 inches, maybe 7. More if you counted his perfectly coiffed hair. It was thick and lustrous, effortlessly perfect, as if every strand was self-aware and knew exactly where it should be. Even the strands that were out of place looked like God himself had carefully positioned them there. The blonde from the bar was tucked neatly under Michelson's arm. Her fingers were laced in his, her bright red nails glistening like a liquid under the overhead lights. Her other hand was tucked into the back pocket of his jeans. "Hell yeah, we do," Duncan said. He punched Michelson in the arm. Michelson laughed. Amber did too. Lewis felt a fresh surge of disgust coursing through his veins. He hadn't been with a woman since his wife left. But Michelson? He could have anyone he wanted, any time he wanted. He didn't even have to try. They flew at him from all directions, like moths to a street lamp. He probably had to swat him away with a tennis racket. Michelson thumped Lewis on the back. "How you doing, my man?" he asked jovially. "Having fun yet?" Lewis opened his mouth to respond, but Michelson didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he leaned close to Amber and said something into her ear, something Lewis couldn't hear. She laughed. Bitter bile bubbled up in the back of Lewis's throat, burning his esophagus. They were talking about him. He knew it. And whatever they were saying, it probably wasn't nice. Guys like Michelson didn't say nice things about guys like him to pretty girls. Lewis had dealt with Michelson's type his whole life. Super friendly, on the surface, until they decide you're inferior. Then they're shoving you in a locker, stealing your clothes while you're in the shower, or pantsing you in front of the whole gym class. "Let's go! The train's leaving!" Duncan yelled. Lewis stepped aside. "You know what? I'm gonna hit the head real quick. I'll catch up with you." Lewis waited until the group was gone, then pulled the waitress's note from his shirt pocket. He unfolded it covertly, down by his hip, and read it again. He wanted to reassure himself that he hadn't misread it, that it was real. It was. The words were unambiguous. "Find me after." He refolded the note, then headed to the end of the bar. His pulse was racing. He waved at the bartender. "Shelby?" he shouted over the music. The bartender's hands were full, carrying a rack of clean glasses. He thrust his chin, signaling for Lewis to turn around. He did. Shelby was behind him. She had traded her waitress uniform for civilian clothes, low-waisted jeans and a tight white t-shirt that contrasted with her tanned skin. Her dark hair was gathered into 2 braids, one on each side of her head. "Want some company?" she asked with a coy smile. Sure." Lewis's mouth suddenly felt full of dry cotton, like his tongue was wearing a sweater. He had no idea what was happening, No frame of reference for a random woman in a bar who was... what? Flirting with him? Is that what she was doing? Sure seemed like it. Sweet! Shelby turned and cupped her hands around her mouth. "Krista!" she shouted. She waved and beckoned with a come here gesture. Another girl emerged from the crowd. She seemed about Shelby's age, mid-20s, Lewis thought, and was dressed similarly in tight jeans and a white halter top. Her auburn hair was pulled into a ponytail at the back of her head. Shelby took Crystal's hand and then turned back to Lewis. "All right, let's go." "You want to do the honors?" Lewis asked. He was sitting on a plush velvet stool in front of a towering slot machine with the words "Money Madness" emblazoned on the front. Shelby sat on his knee, sipping a bright green drink through a skinny straw. Crystal stood behind him, leaning in close. He could feel her breasts pressed against his back. It felt nice. "Come on, big money!" Shelby called out. She slammed her palm down on the spin button. A too loud jingle blared from the machine's speakers, adding to the cacophony of the casino floor. Crystal whooped enthusiastically and then laughed. Lewis laughed too. He was having fun. The first wheel stopped on cherries. The second wheel stopped. Cherries again. "Let's go, let's go, let's go!" Shelby cheered. She crossed her fingers and closed her eyes. The third wheel stopped. Lemon. Shelby opened her eyes and let out a groan of disappointment. Crystal did too. Shelby pouted out her lower lip. "I suck at this," she whined. "I'm sorry." "Don't worry about it," Lewis said. "It's fine." "But we lost all your money," Crystal said. Sure enough, the digital balance readout on the machine read 0. "It's not all my money," Lewis said. He patted her thigh. "Here, get up." Shelby climbed off Lewis's knee and stepped out of the way as he stood. "You two stay here. I'll hit the ATM." "You sure?" Shelby asked. "Sure, I'm sure," Lewis said, with easy confidence. Shelby threw her arms around Lewis's neck and gave him a peck on the cheek. "You're the best," she said. Lewis blushed. "Be right back." He walked down the long aisle of slot machines, then looked back towards Shelby and Crystal. They were both seated on the velvet stool, sharing it half and half, looking at their phones and waiting for him to return. Shit, he said under his breath. He had lost way more than he planned, way more than he could afford. First at the blackjack table, then at poker, and now at the slots. He rarely gambled, which was why. He was bad at it. In fact, he had never won much of anything, ever. He knew he should call it a night and cut his losses, but the truth was he didn't want to. He was having more fun than he'd had in a long time. It was worth it. He got to the ATM, inserted his card, and typed in his PIN. His finger hovered over the withdrawal button for a moment, before course-correcting to hit the check balance button instead. The machine processed the request, then displayed his current balance. Negative $370. Ouch. Suddenly, a loud cheer rose from the bank of slot machines nearby. A chorus of bells and chimes started ringing. More voices joined in the cheering. People began to applaud. Lewis froze. His stomach dropped. He didn't even need to see to know who it was. Fucking Michelson. It had to be. Lewis turned around. Sure enough, Michelson stood in front of a slot machine with jackpot flashing across the screen in a dozen different fonts and colors. A red police light on top of the machine was spinning gleefully. Michelson's fists were thrust toward the ceiling in celebration. Amber, the blonde from the bar, gave him a two-handed high five, then wrapped her arms around his neck. Her hands entwined in his hair as she kissed him deeply. Meanwhile, the digits on the jackpot counter grew and grew, eventually topping out at $10,000. Lewis pivoted back to the ATM, away from Michelson's celebration. He felt like he was going to throw up. How could one guy be so blessed while another, himself, could be so cursed? Was God playing favorites? Is that what it was? Or was it that certain advantages conferred other advantages, which conferred still more advantages, and so on until life was throwing money and pussy at you all day and night? Lewis wondered what his life would have been like if he had been born taller, thinner, or smarter. Maybe he'd be the one winning all the time. Maybe his bank account would be a positive number. Maybe Rachel wouldn't have left him for... "Hey, everything okay?" a sweet voice asked. A hand touched his arm. Lewis turned. Shelby and Crystal were behind him. "You disappeared," Shelby said. "We thought you ditched us," Crystal added with a wink. "Yeah, no, I'm fine," Lewis said. "And just got distracted by my friend over there." He nodded his head towards Michelson. "Lucky guy," Shelby said. "Yeah, sure is." His smile felt like a mouthful of porcelain tiles that might shatter at any moment. "Let me just..." He indicated the ATM. Shelby got the hint. "Oh, yeah, do what you've got to do. We'll be over here." The girls walked away, leaving Lewis alone. He pulled out his wallet, replaced his ATM card, and withdrew a Visa card instead. He inserted it into the ATM, then selected the cash advance option. His finger lingered over the number pad as he debated how much to withdraw. Fuck it. He punched in $500 and hit enter. The machine dispensed a pile of $20 bills. Lewis folded them into a thick wad and shoved them into his front pocket. He walked back over to where Shelby and Crystal were waiting. "All right, where to?" "Right here." Shelby pointed to the slot machine she was standing next to. "I have a good feeling about this one." The graphic on the front of the machine featured a man in a tuxedo leaning against the side of a limousine. Clinging to each of his arms was a gorgeous woman. One was a pouting Marilyn Monroe type in a tight pink gentleman prefer blonde's gown. The other was a ripoff of Breakfast at Tiffany's era Audrey Hepburn, complete with glasses, cigarette holder, and diamond-studded crown. The man's eyebrow was arched, as if to say, "Ain't this the life?" Behind him, triple spotlights illuminated hilltop letters that mimicked the Hollywood sign. They spelled out the name of the machine. Double Lucky. Double ripoff is more like it, Lewis thought. He wasn't going to say that to Shelby, though. No point in spoiling a good thing. Instead, he pulled out the bundle of bills from the ATM, peeled off a fresh 20, and inserted it into the machine. The digital balance readout updated to read $20. "Okay, whose turn is it?" "Yours," Shelby replied. She gave Lewis a peck on the cheek. She responded to his surprised expression, "For good luck." Crystal stepped closer and placed a kiss on Lewis's other cheek. "Make it a double." From your mouth to God's ears, Lewis thought. Then he pressed the spin button. A rousing big band tune blasted from the machine. The wheels accelerated into a blur. The first wheel stopped. Double jackpot. The second wheel stopped. Double jackpot again. "Come on, come on!" Shelby squealed. Crystal bounced and clapped excitedly. Lewis's heart was beating like a boxer's speed bag. The third wheel kept spinning. and spinning. Finally, it stopped. Double jackpot. Pandemonium. Shelby and Crystal started screaming and jumping up and down in celebration. Every light on the slot machine began to flash. The speakers blared a celebratory big band tune. A pair of police sirens began to wail. An artificial ching-ching-ching sound effect blasted from all directions, emulating the sound of a slot machine paying out a fuck-ton of quarters. The hilltop letters flashed on and off in an alternating pattern. Double, lucky, double, lucky, double, lucky. You won! Shelby threw her arms around Lewis's shoulders. Crystal embraced him too. Lewis just stared dumbly at the screen. I won? He asked in a distant voice. His face was blank, unbelieving. Yes, you won, Crystal said. Look! She pointed at the digital jackpot counter as the numbers grew and grew. $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. Double jackpot. That's where they stopped. Twice what Michelson had just won. For a brief moment, the bartender's words from last night drifted through Lewis's mind like a wisp of smoke. Then it was gone. May whatever luck comes to him come to you, ×2. I won, Lewis said again, more sure this time. Then, with growing enthusiasm, I won! A burst of delirious laughter escaped from his lips. It sounded something like happiness. Felt a little like it too. The crowd that had previously surrounded Michelson surged towards Lewis. They clapped and cheered and high-fived each other. Duncan pushed through the crowd and yelled in Lewis's face. Woo! He grabbed Lewis's shoulders and shook him back and forth. Lewis's head bobbed on his neck. Yes, baby, yes! Duncan pounded a fist on Lewis's chest. That's what I'm talking about! Then he threw an arm around Lewis's shoulder and hollered to the crowd, This is my man right here! The crowd cheered even louder. He put Lewis in a friendly headlock and said into his ear, There's your fuck you, pay me. Am I right? Lewis ran his hand over his stubbly hair, wiping away a slick of perspiration that had appeared on his scalp. He felt a swell of emotion rising in his chest. The muscles in his face felt taut. He exhaled a long, shuddering breath. It felt good to win for once. It had been so long. He made a mental note to thank Duncan for forcing him to go out. Duncan was right. He needed it. Lewis scanned the crowd. He wanted Michelson to see him and know he could be a winner too. Not everything in life always went to the quarterback or the class president. That the guy from the math club could get the girl too. Or girls, Lewis thought as he looked at Shelby and Crystal. Plural. Unfortunately, Michelson wasn't in the crowd. Instead, Lewis spotted him across the casino lobby, walking away with his arm around Amber's waist. She clutched his tanned, muscled bicep, her head leaning against his shoulder. Lewis felt a sudden panic. Michelson wasn't even looking. He wasn't going to see. It would all be for nothing. The whole moment would be lost. Hey! Lewis called over the din. Hey, Michelson! Michelson stopped. He looked around, vaguely aware that someone had called his name. Lewis waved his arms. Over here! Michelson spotted Lewis. He crinkled his brow and nodded as if to say, What's up? Check it out! Lewis shouted. I won! Double jackpot! Michelson's lips said, Wow. He gave Lewis a thumbs up. Then he pointed at the top of Amber's head, then towards the elevators. He mouthed, I'm gonna go. Lewis made an okay sign, then watched as Michelson escorted Amber into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, Lewis was suddenly filled with an almost unbearable sense of self-loathing. So he won. So what? Winning didn't take any skill. It was luck, pure and simple. Some random number generator in a computer somewhere spit out the right combination, and he was the dumb fuck who was lucky enough to be sitting in front of the machine when it happened. Tomorrow, he'd go right back to being Ron Lewis, loser for life. It didn't matter how much money he won. He was worthless. That's not true, another voice in his head countered. What about Shelby and Crystal? That wasn't just dumb luck. No computer made Shelby slip him that note. She and Crystal could have bailed hours ago, but they didn't. That had to mean something. It had to. "You'll still be here when I get out?" Lewis asked. To claim his winnings, he had to go with a casino manager to fill out some paperwork in an office somewhere. The casino was authorized to pay up to $10,000 in cash, so Michelson could just walk away with his prize. But the size of Lewis's jackpot meant the casino had to cut him a check instead, and that would take time. Shelby looked at Crystal. Crystal shrugged and nodded. "Fine with me." Shelby replied, "Sure, we've got nowhere else to be. Where should we meet you?" Lewis looked around for a good meeting spot. There was a piano lounge on the other side of the lobby. "How about in there?" "We'll be there," Shelby said. "Promise?" "Promise." Lewis watched them glide across the lobby and disappear into the lounge. "God, they're beautiful," he thought. Then he walked over to the casino manager waiting nearby. "They're with you?" the manager asked. "Yup." "Both of them?" "Yup." "Nice," the manager said, with a knowing nod and a sly smile. "Very nice." Lewis felt a little bump of something unfamiliar jolt through his bloodstream. He wasn't used to another guy reacting to him with... what exactly? Was it envy? Or at least admiration? Something like that. It was probably just a tiny coffee creamer-sized serving of how Michelson felt all the time. But it was nice. I could get used to this, Lewis thought. He hustled to the casino office and rushed through the paperwork as quickly as possible, trying desperately to hang on to the rapidly evaporating contrails of happiness left behind from his win. His leg jittered and bounced while he waited for his check to be cut. He looked at his watch so many times that his shoulder ached. It took almost an hour. It felt like forever. By the time he was done, Lewis's thin veneer of confidence had worn off, leaving a dull, rusted panic in its place. He took the check without even looking at it, stuffed it into his pocket, then tore out of the casino office and made a beeline for the piano lounge. The lounge was a tiny space with a short curved bar and a few cocktail tables arranged around a large piano. It was dimly lit with blue light that spilled from under the bar's edge. Aside from the bartender, the place was empty. Lewis's stomach fell off a cliff, turning over and over as it plunged into darkness. The girls had ditched him. They had promised to stay, and they were gone. Just like his wife, his dad, and everyone who fucking mattered in his life. And yet, he kept falling for it, repeatedly, every goddamned time. He felt so stupid. "Hey!" The bartender waved his towel to get Lewis's attention. "You Lewis?" Lewis pointed at his chest. "Me? Yeah, I'm Lewis." "They'll be right back. They went to the bathroom." Lewis's stomach bounced off the floor and up into his throat. He laughed a little, relieved. "Okay, great. Thought I lost him." He took a seat at one of the cocktail tables. A minute later, Shelby and Crystal returned. They saw him and walked over to where he sat. "Hey, did the bartender—" Shelby started. "Yeah, he told me." "Okay, good." She pulled out a chair and sat down. Crystal did too. "We didn't want you to think we bailed." "No, of course not," Lewis lied. "I would never think that." "So, now what?" Shelby asked. She looked at Crystal. "Up to you," Crystal said. Lewis rubbed his palms back and forth along the tops of his thighs. His hands were freezing, but sweating. He was more nervous than ever about anything in his life. He had an idea. It came to him while he was waiting in the casino office, and he spent the rest of the time trying to decide what to do about it. He had never thought about it before, never even considered a possibility for someone like him. But what the hell? He was feeling lucky. Maybe tonight would be the night. "Yeah, so I was thinking..." His voice seemed to be disconnected from his brain. It was like he was floating outside his body, watching himself talk. He couldn't believe what he was saying. "The casino comped me a room for the night, so I thought maybe you two might want to come up and hang out or something." Shelby and Crystal exchanged glances. Shelby shifted uncomfortably in her chair. I don't know if that's such a good idea." Lewis's stomach tightened. He felt the overwhelming urge to retreat, to just curl up into a ball and roll out of the bar in shame. But then he pictured Michelson, so confident, heading to the elevators with Amber, a girl he had met only hours before, wrapped around his finger. Michelson wouldn't give up that easily, would he? Fuck no, he wouldn't. "Why not?" Lewis asked. "We've been having a good time, right? Let's keep it going." "Yeah, we have, but..." Shelby struggled to find the right words. "But we're not like..." She looked at Crystal with a help me expression. "It's just a no, okay?" Crystal said. She started to stand, looking at Shelby with a pointed glare. "We should go." "Yeah." Shelby stood up too. She slung her purse over her shoulder. "Yeah, it's getting late." She extended her hand to Lewis. "It was nice meeting you, though." Lewis sat back in his chair and folded his arms over his chest. "So that's it then," he said, looking from Shelby to Crystal and back to Shelby. Shelby awkwardly lowered her hand. Crystal spoke up. "Look, your friend didn't say anything about..." Shelby bumped Crystal with her elbow. Crystal rolled her eyes. "Can we just go?" she said to Shelby. "It's enough already." Lewis sat up straight in his chair. "Friend? What friend?" "Nothing," Shelby said. "Don't listen to her." "No, tell me. What friend? What did he say? Was it Duncan?" Lewis's heart was trying to kick its way out of his ribcage. His face felt hot. His eyes burned. What did Duncan tell her? And why? "He paid us, all right?" Crystal tugged Shelby's arm. "I told you this guy's a creep. Let's go." Shelby ignored Crystal. "I'm sorry," Shelby said to Lewis. "I'm just a waitress. I'm not a... you know. I don't do those kinds of things, not for money. And Crystal's just my friend. I asked her to come." Lewis was staring past her into space. She tried to make eye contact with him. "I really did have a nice time, though." "So, what do you do for money?" Lewis asked coldly. His eyes narrowed and connected with Shelby's. She took a step backward, as if pushed by an unseen hand. The expression on her face turned from one of sympathy to one of fear. Good, Lewis thought. "Hey, it's not our fault you can't get girls on your own," Crystal sneered. "Crystal?" Shelby spun at her, mortified. She pointed out of the lounge at the lobby. "Wait out there, please," she snapped. "You're not helping." "But go!" Crystal snatched her jacket off the back of the chair and stormed away. "This is so stupid." Shelby watched her friend leave, then turned back to Lewis. His elbows were on the cocktail table. His face was in his hands. "Hey, listen," Shelby said. "I'm sorry, okay? That was out of line." "Who paid you?" Lewis asked quietly. His hands muffled his voice. He dragged his hands down his face. They fell into his lap, limp. He tilted his head back, his face towards the ceiling. His eyes were closed. "Was it Duncan?" "Duncan?" Shelby's eyes rolled upwards as she tried to remember the name. "No, it was your friend, you know, the guy who... Captain America, who bought your drinks. Michael something." Lewis opened his eyes. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Fucking Michelson? That motherfucker? He tried to speak, but his voice was just a whisper. "Michelson," he said. "Yeah, that's it. He said he felt bad. Something about a bonus you didn't get. He wanted you to have a good time and asked if we would help. He said you've had a tough run of it lately and deserved some fun." She tried to catch Lewis's eyes again. "He was trying to help you." Lewis leaned forward and glared at Shelby. His eyes looked like two black marbles, cold and lifeless. His voice was a low growl. "How much did he pay you?" Shelby looked at the floor. Her cheeks were damp. 1,000. Lewis laughed bitterly. 1,000, he repeated. "Each," Shelby finished. Lewis looked down at his hands. They were clenched into fists. His knuckles were white. "Get out." Shelby wiped her eyes with the heels of her hands, smearing her makeup. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to..." "Get out!" Lewis yelled. He pounded both fists down on the cocktail table. The heavy mirrored tabletop shattered under the blow, disintegrating into a shower of broken glass. Shelby recoiled, then ran from the piano lounge. She didn't look back. Lewis held his hands up in front of his face. Shards of glass were embedded in his flesh. Dark rivers of blood ran down his wrists and dripped onto the floor. He felt no pain, only rage. He was angry at the girls for deceiving him, for making him think they were there for him instead of the money. He was angry at himself for falling for it. And he was angry at Michelson for, well, everything. A blur of motion drew Lewis's attention toward the bar. The bartender had picked up a phone on the wall. He kept one eye on Lewis as he started to dial. Lewis saw him. "Hey!" he shouted. He jumped up, sending the chair tumbling backward. He pushed the remains of the broken table out of his way. It crashed to the floor. Lewis's shoes crunched on the broken glass. He strode towards the bar, plunging one of his bloodied hands deep into his pocket as he went. The bartender dropped the phone and raised his hands in front of his chest, palms out. "Please, don't..." Lewis pulled out the thick wad of 20s he had withdrawn from the ATM earlier. He flung them at the bartender. The bartender flinched, shielding his face with his hands. A spray of blood droplets flew through the air with the money, peppering the bartender's white shirt as the cash hit him in the chest and dropped to the floor. Lewis was gone when the bartender lowered his hands away from his face. Lewis sat in his car with the engine running. His headlights were off. The roof of the casino parking lot was dotted with pools of light, surrounded by wide spans of inky darkness. Lewis's car was in the shadows. His was one of only 2 vehicles remaining on the roof level. The other was a Tesla. Michelson's Tesla. It was parked at the opposite end of the parking garage, near a large assembly of massive industrial fans that provided ventilation for the casino. The fans' roar was loud enough for Lewis to hear them, even with his windows closed. They made a droning hum that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. Lewis's hands were on the steering wheel. His breathing was calm, steady. The blood on his forearms had dried into twisted brown smears. Tiny shards of glass still poked from his skin. He ignored them. His eyes were fixed on a single spot across the garage, a blue metal door under a glowing green sign that read, "Exit." Lewis wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting there. It seemed like hours. The sky to the east was a filthy, grayish-yellow color that reminded Lewis of his father's tobacco-stained teeth. It was the beginning of sunrise, he supposed. He'd be expected to be in the office in a few short hours. He didn't care. He would never be going to work again. The blue metal door opened. Lewis sat forward in his seat, suddenly alert. A figure was silhouetted in the doorway, backlit against the light from the stairwell. Lewis couldn't tell who it was, but then he heard the chirp of a car alarm being deactivated. The taillights on Michelson's Tesla blinked twice. It was him. Lewis watched as Michelson strolled towards the Tesla, spinning the key fob around his index finger as he walked. His stride was casual and confident, the walk of a man on an unbroken path whose perfect life was unfolding perfectly before him, every day proceeding exactly as planned. Everything was right for him. Everything worked to his advantage. There was nothing out of place, nothing incomplete, no desire unfulfilled. Every pitch was a strike, every at-bat a home run. Every game is a perfect game. A life unspoiled by defeat, disappointment, or loss. Until now. As Michelson passed in front of Lewis's car, Lewis flipped on his high beams. Michelson froze, suddenly blinded by the searing light. He threw up his forearm in front of his face to shield his eyes from the glare. His expression was confused, uncomprehending. Lewis slammed his foot down on the gas pedal, smashing it to the floor. His tires squealed. Black smoke poured out from under his rear bumper. The car lurched forward, accelerating towards Michelson. Michelson's reaction was delayed. Maybe he was still buzzed from a long night of drinking, or maybe his brain just couldn't quite fathom what was happening. By the time his legs started moving, Lewis's car was already closing in on him. Michelson ran. He sprinted straight at first. Then he zigzagged to the left, then to the right. Lewis tracked his every move, keeping him dead center between his headlights. Michelson threw a look over his shoulder. His face was a mask of abject terror. He was going to die, and he knew it. Just as Lewis's car was upon him, Michelson dove to his right. The car hit him while airborne, throwing him over the hood. His shoulder collided with the windshield, shattering it into a spiderweb of fractured glass. The impact sent him over the roof, his body cartwheeling sideways into the bank of industrial fans. A horrible grinding sound echoed through the parking garage as his unconscious body smashed through the fan's protective grating and into the powerful blades inside. Lewis's car continued straight, heading for the edge of the parking garage roof. He never slowed down. Lewis was awake. There hadn't been any feeling of waking up or coming to. No gradual transition from unconscious to conscious. It was like someone had just flipped a switch. There was nothing, and then there was something. He realized he could hear noises, beeps and hisses, and the gentle drone of an air conditioner or a fan, but he couldn't see anything. Everything was black. He heard a voice, a man's voice. It was muffled and distorted, like it was being played on toy speakers from a vinyl record that had warped in the heat. He didn't recognize the voice, but he understood the words. "Mr. Lewis, can you hear me?" Lewis tried to speak, but his throat felt like he had swallowed a bale of barbed wire. He suddenly realized that he was choking. Something seemed to be in his throat, gagging him. He panicked, trying to lift his hand to pull out whatever it was so he could breathe. But he couldn't move. As hard as he tried, he couldn't lift his arms. Either of them. He didn't understand. What was happening? Was he tied down, or... With dawning horror, Lewis tried to move his legs. He couldn't feel them either. "Oh my God," Lewis thought. "I'm paralyzed." He tried to sit up, but a strong pair of hands pressed on his shoulders, holding him down. "Hey now, take it easy, just relax," a different voice said, closer to his face. This one belonged to a woman. Its tone was firm, but kind. "Who are you?" Lewis wanted to scream. "Where am I?" He lifted his head and tried to sit up again, but the hands held him down. Then he realized he could feel the hands on his shoulders. If he was paralyzed, he wouldn't be able to feel them touching him, right? Lewis relaxed. He settled back into the mattress. Maybe he wasn't paralyzed after all. As he stopped struggling, the hands released their pressure on his shoulders. The man's voice spoke again. "Mr. Lewis, I'm Dr. Grace. If you can hear me, can you nod?" Lewis nodded. "Great," the doctor said. "Do you know where you are?" Lewis shook his head. "No," he croaked. His throat felt like it was full of broken glass. "Okay, you're in Our Lady of Mercy Hospital. We just removed a tube from your throat, so it's best if you don't try to talk just yet. It's going to be pretty raw for a while." Lewis nodded again. He swallowed, then winced. It hurt like hell. "Do you remember anything about what happened?" Lewis shook his head again, but as soon as he did, a series of memories flickered across his mind like still frames from an old-time flipbook. The casino, the girls, the double jackpot, the cocktail table shattered, the car, Michelson. Fucking Michelson. Now a different voice spoke, another man, one he recognized. "Hey, Lewis, it's Mike Duncan from work. You remember me?" Lewis nodded. He remembered Duncan. He sat in the next cubicle over at the office. "I just stopped by to see how you were doing and, well, I guess I got lucky. The doctor says this is your first time awake since the accident." The accident? Lewis thought. So they thought it was an accident. That was good. "Water," Lewis whispered. The woman's voice spoke. Maybe a nurse? "It's too soon to give you water, but I can give you some ice if you'd like." Lewis nodded. "Please." "Coming right up." He heard the woman walking away, her footsteps muted on the tile floor. "I'll give you a few minutes with your friend," the doctor said. "Thanks, doctor," Duncan responded. Heavier footsteps. Then a door closed and latched with a click. "Can you talk?" Duncan asked. Lewis opened his jaw and moved his tongue around. It felt foreign to him, like a piece of raw meat in his mouth. He swallowed again. Flames tore at his esophagus. "Hey," he managed to whisper. His voice sounded like a handful of crinkling straw. "What happened?" "Oh, man," Duncan said. His voice was shaky. "Well, there was an accident, but you're okay. You made it through." "Michelson," Lewis croaked. "He made it too," Duncan said. His voice cut out, choked by a sob. "I'm sorry. Man, this is so fucked up." "He's okay?" Lewis asked. Duncan coughed out a mortified laugh despite himself. "Not really. He got chewed up pretty badly. Lost an arm, a leg, an eye. His whole right side is it's bad. He barely made it, and he's not out of the woods yet. He's got a long way to go. Years, they said." Lewis felt a wave of familiar anger boiling inside him. Of course Michelson survived, Lewis thought with bitter sarcasm. Of course he did. Lewis was such a loser that he couldn't even murder someone without fucking it up. But then, a different thought occurred to him. Dying was easy, almost too easy. But surviving was a bitch. Surviving meant Michelson would have to live the rest of his life handicapped, disfigured, and partially blind, the whole time knowing what he used to be, what he had lost, what he could never be again. The more Lewis thought about it, the better the whole thing sounded. Then Duncan spoke again, interrupting Lewis's internal monologue. "Rachel came to see you." The words hit Lewis head on, crushing him like a car in one of those crash tests where someone drives a Hyundai into a brick wall. His heart seemed to stop for a second, suspended in midair, before tripping over itself to regain its rhythm. Rachel? His Rachel? He felt a sob rising in his throat. The very idea that she was there for him, that she came back after everything that had happened between them, after everything he had said, everything he had done, was overwhelming. Maybe she still loved him. Maybe there was still a chance for them after all. "She's here?" Lewis asked, his voice wavering on the edge of tears. Duncan was silent. Lewis asked again, more clearly this time. "Duncan, is she here?" "No," he said quietly. "Not today. She came when she heard what happened, but she left. She didn't want to see you like this." "Like what?" There was another long silence. Finally, Duncan spoke. "Maybe I should get the doctor." Lewis heard a chair creak as Duncan stood. "Duncan, wait! Like what?" Lewis asked again. "What's happening? Am I paralyzed?" Duncan didn't answer. Lewis heard the door open, followed by the soft footsteps of the nurse's sneakers and the louder clacks of the doctor's loafers. Duncan put a hand on Lewis's shoulder. "I'm gonna run. It's good to see you. Stay strong, brother." Lewis tried to reach up and pat Duncan's hand, but he still couldn't move his arm. He settled for a nod. "Thanks for coming, Mike." Duncan's footsteps receded, out of the room. Then, Lewis felt the cold wetness of ice on his lips. "Here you go," the nurse said softly. "Some ice for you." Lewis opened his mouth. The nurse spooned some soft, tasteless ice chips into his mouth. They dissolved on his tongue, sending a trickle of freezing water down his shredded throat. It felt good. "Thanks," he whispered. Lewis heard the sound of a wheeled stool being rolled closer. It squeaked as the doctor sat. "Mr. Lewis, we need to talk." "Am I paralyzed?" Lewis asked. "No," the doctor confirmed. "You're not paralyzed. Luckily, the damage from the crash didn't affect your spine. You had a severe concussion and some serious swelling in your brain, but we managed that effectively. There should be no permanent brain damage." Lewis felt a wave of relief. No permanent damage. Good. Good. The doctor continued. "The accident was very serious, but between the airbags, the seatbelt, and the other safety features, you made it out relatively unscathed, considering." Lewis heard paper turning, as if the doctor was flipping through his chart. Concussion, severe contusions and lacerations, stitches and staples in your scalp, a few broken ribs, broken tibias left and right. I know this sounds like a lot, but given the severity of the accident, it's incredible that you survived it at all. You're a very lucky man, Mr. Lewis. He heard the doctor close his file. "Do you remember anything about what happened?" "Not much." Lewis's thoughts turned inwards as he tried to remember. The longer he was awake, the more his memory started to fill in, like a roll of film developing in a chemical bath. There was still a thin gauze over the whole night, a milky cataract that obscured some of the details, but he began to remember more distinctly the events that preceded the crash. The note was in his pocket. She and her friend are coming with him to the casino, winning the double jackpot. The waitress gives him the extra beer. Then, the piano lounge. The embarrassment. The betrayal. Michelson had paid them. He thought Lewis was so pathetic that the only way a girl would hang out with him was if she was paid to do it. Fucking Michelson, he thought for the 1,000th time. We did everything we could, but... Lewis realized that the doctor was still talking. He hadn't been listening. All his mental energy had gone to piecing together the memories of that night. "Sorry, can you repeat that?" Lewis said. It's hard to focus." "Yes, of course," the doctor said. "I understand this is a lot to process. I can come back later when you're feeling stronger." No, it's all right. Just say that again. Before we did everything we could." "Okay." The doctor took a deep breath and exhaled. "I was saying that you were lucky to survive the accident. You and Mr. Michelson are both very, very lucky. But after..." The doctor's voice wavered, as if on the edge of tears. "Mr. Lewis, I'm so sorry. We did everything..." There was a click in his throat as he swallowed a hitching breath. "We did everything we could, but the infection was just too aggressive. It was resistant to antibiotics, to every intervention we tried." A heavy veil of dread draped over Lewis like a lead blanket. He could feel it pressing on his chest, compressing his lungs, and collapsing his ribcage. Terror tightened around his throat like a noose, threatening to strangle him. "The infection was pervasive and extensive," the doctor continued. "We fought it with everything we had, but in the end, we had no choice but to..." The doctor took another shaky breath. "But to amputate." Amputate. The word shot through Lewis's head like a hollow point bullet, shredding his mind into jagged ribbons of horror as it exploded through his skull. "My arms," he managed to say. "Yes," the doctor replied. I'm sorry. Your arms. And your legs. And your eyes." An animal groan started building in Lewis's throat. The sound of incomprehensible grief, terror, regret, and every one of the darkest emotions of human existence, of any existence, all combined into a single, horrible wail. The beeping from Lewis's heart monitor grew faster. The room's sounds grew elastic, elongating and contracting, the volume rising and falling. His breath came in short, choppy gasps. He couldn't breathe. He was suffocating. The doctor's voice broke through the swells of static pulsing in Lewis's ears. "I understand how difficult. If there's someone we can call, a spouse or significant other." The room's sounds receded into silence, like a passing police siren trailing off into the distance. All that was left was the sound of Lewis's heartbeat, his breathing, and then a voice, his own. "Give me that kind of luck for once, you know? Let me get 2. 1 for him, 2 for me. Is that too much to ask?" "Not at all," the disembodied voice of the bartender said. Lewis heard the gurgling sound of whiskey pouring into a glass. A double. "To Michelson," the bartender proclaimed. "May whatever luck comes to him come to you, ×2. "Amen," Lewis said. The clink of their glasses resonated like a chime in a cathedral. "From your mouth to God's ears." One last thought slipped through the darkness as Lewis drifted away into unconsciousness. Fucking Michelson.
One. A single white rose quietly fell from her slim young fingers. I looked down and saw it had landed on the dark walnut top of the casket. The beautiful wooden box somehow seemed out of place in the cold contoured hole in the soil. No one who stood encircled around this opening in the ground had expected his sudden death. And that's what it was. Death. One couldn't ease the outcome or pretty up the bluntness of today by calling it past, departed, or perished. When a loved one like David leaves this world in the manner he left, the only appropriate word is death. Cold, harsh, and final. Maggie May Duvain, or Magpie as she was called by many, clenched her smooth young hand, which had clutched the flower throughout the entire service. The back of her hand still moist from the teardrops she had constantly wiped away. Her eyes quickly replenished the flow. A constant stream of the salty liquid slid down her already saturated cheeks. There wasn't a dry eye amongst those gathered so tightly, all dressed in their Sunday best black. David would have hated that part, the black suits and dresses. I don't believe I ever saw David in a black suit. He despised the attire. The sound of Magpie's subdued whimpers rose above and then mixed with the myriad of echoes of the other's grief and despair, a sad melancholy tune of human emotion. It drew my thoughts back to why I was here. I remembered how David hadn't wanted to be buried. The whole idea of it freaked him out. The thought of being trapped under the ground in a box with worms and ants crawling around and feeding on his remains abhorred him. He'd insisted he would be cremated, and his wife would take those ashes on a trip to remember and either cast them into the Pacific Ocean on Oahu's North Shore or nestle the small jar tightly into a rocky nook on Cana Point, a beautiful favorite spot on the farthest western point of the island. Lava had created the cliffs that overlooked a constant symphony of crashing waves, creating a kind of hymn they both loved. They had in fact met and fallen in love on that island so many years back. While now the two of them weren't the couple always holding hands every second of the day, they loved deeply and were devoted to one another. Those two spots out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean had been David and his wife's favorite places that they had visited together. David had said, "It might take one of us dying to get back there, but one day we'll return." A memory that now stung my heart, wondering if his words had somehow foreshadowed the reason we were now gathered. I wasn't certain why that wish of being taken back there was not kept, but it didn't feel like the proper time or place to question such a thing. Not now on this day. After all, I had recently moved away, chasing my dreams of writing novels up in the ruggedness of Alaska, much more than a stone's throw from Missouri. David and I, of course, kept up on each other's projects, critiquing and criticizing each other's work with bated tongues. No distance of miles could squelch that. Some friendships outlast about anything. Well, anything but death. There would be no recalibrating that fact and working around it, and that thought brought sudden anguish to me. David was not a replaceable friend by any means. Those weekly Saturday night phone conversations or Zoom meetings would now be no more. I was again drawn back to my purpose today by the sight of little Magpie holding her grandmother's hand. She grasped it tightly in one, the now missing white rose from the other, ripped my heart to shreds once more, like a scab being pulled away abruptly from a wound too fresh to be healed. It coldly reminded me that David was now lying in that lonely box laid in the ground, a final resting place he so adamantly feared. I glanced around the circle and surmised I wasn't the only one touched deeply by Magpie's brokenness in the moment. It was nearly more difficult than losing my good friend David itself, and just as his writing was becoming more recognized. What a shame he wouldn't be here now to see it or feel the kudos and acknowledgement of all the hard work he had done. Sometimes I believed he enjoyed living more in his world of dark fiction than he had in his real life, and I'll be the first to admit the thought had worried me at times, deeply. No one likes to admit it. In fact, most just avoid the thoughts. But there is a hungry power hidden within the darkness, be it the physical world, the internal world, or the written world within one's imagination. More than once in one of our many conversations after hanging up, I would question if David was slipping away in little slivers, maybe struggling a bit without calling out for help as he treaded the dark waters of his mind. There I go, thinking in the flowery internal language of a writer. I remember he used to goad me about the lack of ability to turn the writer's spigot off. I smiled briefly before his absence was announced to me again in the quiet sniffles from mourners in pain. More tears slid down Magpie's cheeks. Her little face was so contorted in sadness. "Oh, sweetie, I know you will miss him, but I know he misses you already," were the words I wanted to whisper to her if I were standing beside her. It was all I could do to turn away and walk back to my car, knowing not only had the world lost one of the good guys who could provoke deep thought, but that sweet little girl had lost her hero, her savior, the grandfather who, along with his loving wife, had rescued her from the darkness of her mommy's poor choices. Now only memories were left that would eventually fade in time until nothing but the jog of a framed photograph sitting on the mantel or a table would bring. It, of course, would then be a watered-down recollection of what he had once been to her. Damn, I should just shut my mind off. I'm depressing the hell out of myself even more than the reason I'm back in this little town who thought it was big. Springfield.
Grandma, why did Grandpa die? Is he with my mommy now?
Maggie asked as she dragged her free hand across her eyes again to clear the stinging tears away. Oh, honey, I know this is so hard to understand. Life is hardly ever fair. I'm not sure how to answer that question, Magpie. Just know that your grandpa loves you more than all the stars in the sky. And now that he lives up amongst them, she wiped her tears back slowly with her finger. Just know that he is always in our hearts and also looking down on us with loving eyes, wishing he could hold you in one of your squeezy hugs, Coraline answered as she pulled her little granddaughter tightly into her side and squeezed.
And I love him more than all the grains of sand on every beach in the world, Grandma. And I always will. Please promise me I won't forget about him.
Magpie tried to be brave, but when you lose your favorite grandpa in the world at the early age of 8, it just doesn't seem to make sense. And there is rarely a way to make it do just that ever again. Would some ice cream help, Magpie? Grandma asked. Her little face looked up as if she was trying to contemplate her answer. She then suddenly shook her head no and spoke softly.
It just wouldn't taste sweet today, Grandma. I think I'd rather go home and be sat in Grandpa's chair. I think I'm just supposed to think about him today. That's all.
Coraline held her sweet little granddaughter's hand tightly as they made their way back to the car. Coraline watched from the corner of her eye and noticed Magpie steal a last glimpse of her grandpa's spot under the tent in the cemetery. She couldn't hold back the tears, and they overpowered her battle to squelch them like a big girl might. In between erratic sobs, she asked,
Can we come back again to visit Grandpa, please? I don't want him to be here alone with all the other dead people in the ground. I think he will need to know we will come see him. A lot.
Of course, Magpie. We'll make it a regular trip. I think we both will need to visit. We'll bring a white rose when we come back. Magpie nodded in agreement as she pulled a single white petal from her pocket and clutched it tightly in her hand. The car door closed and Coraline started the engine. As she began pulling away, she too felt the need to steal one more glance back where David was put to rest, knowing the secret that no one else knew. 2. I sat in the overstuffed reading chair which sat closely to the large gas log fireplace in the hotel lobby. The heat knocked the edge off the cold evening, especially after the dreary day at the funeral service. I felt like trying to connect with my good friend David, not yet willing or ready to say goodbye. I began reading his last book, the one he had just gotten the author's proof of. It had arrived in a large manila envelope just 2 weeks earlier, and I now felt guilty I hadn't gotten around to opening it. He had told me it was his best. He had said on the phone that night, "It is so real to me that it almost scares the bejesus out of me. Is that bizarre or what?" He snickered afterwards, so I had not taken him seriously. I now wish I had. Woulda, coulda, shoulda, I thought to myself. I continued reading, but then after a chapter, I pushed the book forward in my lap and folded it closed. I held my finger between the pages where I'd stopped reading. I suddenly needed to see the front cover again. Shaking my head after studying it, I was amazed of how well it portrayed the feeling I was getting from its words written within. The story was powerful from the very start. It was foreboding and chilling. David had seemed to always own a knack to suck the reader into his story's surroundings. Usually, the front covers he created painted that visual picture very clearly. A picture paints 1,000 words. Well, David used both equally well. It was usually almost uncanny, as this one certainly was. It was as if each book he had published was truly a macabre twist of his own personal story he was telling. He was so in tune with the entire process. But no one could survive if they were surrounded by all the dark thoughts that his books provoked. The title for this novel was telling enough if you knew David at all. Titled, Never Cage a Magpie by D.D. Duvain. Yes, David Duncan Duvain was a born weaver of tales. The story was about a young woman growing up in Kimmswick, Missouri, a little town along the banks of the Mississippi River. A wholesome little town that also held its share of dark secrets, as many small towns do. The young woman had gotten tangled up in the drug world and just dropped her daughter off one day at her parents', never to return or see them or her daughter again. As I read this story, it was obvious to me that it was at least loosely based on the dark secrets of his daughter's exploits. I couldn't tell for sure which parts were true and which were enhanced to make the story's fiction even more provocative. It was heart-wrenching, though. I knew he himself held deep pain he rarely shared aloud. As I looked at the artwork on the cover, a shadowy silhouette of a young woman with a caged bird in the foreground, I could feel his personal grief. The cover was in dark blacks and grays with a stark blinding white. The title stood out in subdued crimson red, the font slashed in as if tearing from the page like fingernails through skin. It was very grabbing and immediately drew an emotion of fear within. The cover alone would draw a reader of dark fiction to immediately pick it up. David always liked to twist a dark undertone into everyday humanity and emotions. Instead of always focusing on the silver lining as some writers do, he would draw out the bleak pain and then carefully mix it with fading hope, but enough warmth to keep you hoping for an outcome that you could live with. His stories toyed with the reader in ways that would make one nervous of what might happen on the next page. Would it be something lovely and touching, or would you be instantly reeled in to be shred to pieces with shock and rebuke? You wanted to turn the page to investigate on the one hand, but on the other, the thought brought great apprehension and toil. A roller coaster ride you were unable to climb out of the strapped-in seat until it came to a screeching and sudden halt called the end. His books always stuck with me for long periods of time after finishing them. I would lay in bed trying to sleep, but instead would find myself reasoning with the characters and their choices as if I could convince them to reconsider and have a different outcome. As I reopened this book and began reading every word more carefully, I again became sucked back into the quagmire I now feared was his real world being displayed on paper. My heart suddenly went out to David. There isn't any way he couldn't have been tormented within. Was he writing books like this to aid his escape from the pain? Or was this the poison that enabled his darkness to overtake him, even feed him? Would anyone ever know that answer now? Did I truly ever know David like I had always assumed I did all these years? I immediately thought about Magpie. I wondered if she was okay tonight. My heart suddenly broke. She had lost her mother already only a short time back. That most certainly was devastating, especially in the way she was dropped off at David and Coraline's. Brandy, her mother, telling her she'd see her soon, but then disappearing into a life of choosing to stay away. And now out of nowhere, it seemed, David, crashing his car off the bridge into that cold, deep lake. Of course, Magpie certainly wasn't given the details, but nonetheless, David is gone and never to return. I felt sorry for Coraline. I couldn't imagine what it was like in her home tonight. The whole thing seemed crazy and so abrupt. The oddity of it was that as I read on in his new yet unpublished book, I felt I was reading the script of what was to come in his real life. It was as if he already knew ahead of time and created this novel to tell the story once he was gone. Part of me couldn't read the words quick enough to find out what happened, as if I were a private investigator that had stumbled onto a hidden treasure trove of evidence. Of course, the other part wanted to throw the book down and never pick it up again, instead choosing to remember my friend as he once was before this tragedy robbed him from our world. God damn you, David, for not reaching out before leaving me with this quandary of what to do now that you're gone. I, of course, succumbed and turned the page to continue. Immediately drawn back in, I knew deep inside there never was any other choice to make. I'd been fooling myself to think there ever was. 3.
But I saw him, Grandma. Grandpa was with me, and I read him a book.
Magpie cried out. Her body shook as the tears flowed. Oh, honey, it was a dream, sweetie. I'm not surprised you would dream about him. Coraline rubbed Maggie's back to try and calm her.
I love you, Grandma, but I want my mommy and my grandpa too.
I know you do, Magpie. I do too, sweetie. Do you want me to crawl into your bed and snuggle?
You're not going to leave me too, are you?
She asked her grandma, her eyes staring intently into her Coraline's. Coraline crawled under the covers and spooned with her granddaughter. No, sweet Magpie, I'm not ever going to leave you. You're stuck with me, like glue. She forced a giggle from the hollowness she really felt to help comfort Maggie. She knew the nights were going to be rough for quite a while. Tonight was horribly difficult for her. She couldn't imagine what it was like for Magpie. She rubbed Maggie's back softly and quietly assured her everything was going to be all right. Am I really telling her this to make her feel better? Or am I trying to convince myself? I hadn't been alone since meeting David in Hawaii. What, 25 years ago? Oh, David, these dark angels inside of you. Why didn't you let me know of your struggles? The moment she heard tiny snores of Magpie, Coraline broke down and fought back the heaves her body beckoned. Heavy, salted tears flowed and burned her eyes. Damn it, David. I need you. I can't do this alone. Why did you have to dive so deep into your darkness? Life can be funny in a frightful sort of way, like when you truly feel like you are drowning under the total weight of the ocean. You're fighting to squeeze that one last breath into your lungs, giving you just one more minute of life. But then suddenly something snaps, and you find yourself treading that same water, except now you feel almost comfortable. Your head once again above the rough water's surface, you feel safe. That memory of the harsh and scary moments just seconds ago quickly fade into a distant past. You instantly forget the paralyzing pain that had just held you captive in fear. Yet you always remain cognizant of the struggle hovering overhead. This is everyday life suffering with depression and anxiety. Coraline woke up and sensed she had been with David. She knew it was impossible, but when there was movement in the bed beside her, she quickly turned, almost expecting to see him lying next to her. She instead found Maggie. The warm feeling of imagining it was David lying next to her did not, however, dissipate. She tried to hang on to the sensation if she could. Her granddaughter's overheated young body was the source of comfort which helped feed her ability to maintain this moment of thought. Coraline instantly felt as if she would be able to continue and even grow her life back to a sense of normalcy. She felt David somehow gave her that miraculous feeling of instant confidence, even though he wasn't here. He was still inside her heart and helping her steer the bow of their ship into the direction needed. She'd have to keep convincing their little Magpie, but she felt a sense of conviction that was not there yesterday. Maggie woke up and surprisingly, her mood wasn't full of the sadness or distress it had been at bedtime last night. Her first words surprised Coraline.
Grandma, why do you and Grandpa and others like Connor call me Magpie? I've always wondered, but today I just feel like I'm supposed to ask. Weird, huh?
She asked. Well, Maggie, what is your favorite thing to do?
Oh, come on, Grandma. Don't you even know that? Singing, of course. I love to sing, silly.
Maggie answered. That's right. And guess what magpie birds enjoy doing? Coraline asked.
Sing?
Maggie asked. Yes, indeed. And that is why your grandpa started calling you Magpie as a little girl. You've always loved to sing, and your voice is as beautiful as any songbirds. Magpies are also the only known birds that can recognize themselves in a mirror. Don't ask me how they know that, but Lord knows you spend enough time in front of the mirror to recognize yourself too. Magpies are also one of the smartest and cleverest of birds. Sound familiar? Coraline chuckled.
Plus,
Maggie smiled with the grin of knowing.
Magpie starts with the same 3 letters as my name, Maggie. M-A-G.
Indeed it does, Coraline retorted. Magpie's bright green eyes suddenly dimmed. A tear began to poke out from under each eyelid. Before they had time to slide down her cheeks, she ran and was in her grandmother's arms.
I want my grandpa back. I don't want him to have to be in that hole in the ground. I don't want him to be dead anymore. And I just know he's so scared and lonely without us.
We'll go today to check, Magpie. Coraline knew she couldn't cave and start something that may impede her healing, but she was weak. We can't do this every day, but I think today is appropriate. 4. The phone rang and Coraline got up to answer it. Hello? Oh, hello, Connor. It's good to hear your voice. Do you have a moment? He asked. I suppose. What's on your mind? Have you read David's last book, Cora? There was a brief silence on the line. Well, I didn't know you even had copies of it yet. and I'm sure you know that his later books are not really something I enjoy reading. Too much of the dark side of life. I know, Coraline, but he had sent me an author's proof a couple of days before I'm sorry, I hate to bring anything up, but this book, this is very strange. What do you mean, Connor? Strange like how? I can't explain it over the phone. Can we get together sometime soon, before I have to head back to Seward? And Magpie, how is she? Moody and teary-eyed one moment, and then almost normal the next. So, you've not seen the cover either? Or the title of this book? Connor inquired. No. Why are you being so surreptitious about this book? Coraline, it's a story foretelling events. Real events. Things in life that led up to... Connor cleared his throat twice. His accident or act. Even the title is... well, it's just odd. Okay, Connor, you are kind of freaking me out. I'm not sure I'm ready for this. I know. I got it out last night to look at. I felt bad that I hadn't gotten around to read even a line before, I was wanting to feel some closeness to him or maybe get some closure. He cleared his throat again and coughed slightly. I started reading it, and as I did, I wanted to stop and put it down, but I couldn't make myself. Okay, Connor, what's the title that is so odd? Never Cage a Magpie. What? Coraline asked in an almost agitated tone. Why would he title it after Maggie? She followed with a growing defensive manner. I know, not like his usual thriller titles. It's why I asked. So, you haven't seen the cover artwork either? No, and I'm afraid to ask now, she answered. There was a hush over the line. The seconds drew by. Connor? Magpie can't hear about any of this. Almost cutting Connor off, Coraline answered very defensively. I know, Connor. This may be my first time alone for a long while, but it's not my first rodeo with my granddaughter. I know what to keep her away from... I'm sorry, Coraline. I'm just a little wigged out. I've been up reading almost all night trying to finish the book. It's definitely no book for a child. It's like drawing me in as if I'm a cop trying to solve a crime. We need to talk. I'm leaving this Friday. Okay. 5. Never Cage a Magpie, Chapter 38. The dark angels are surrounding me again. They pull and tear at me as if I were a piece of dead animal lying flattened alongside the road. The turkey vultures quibbling over which gets the tasty brain meat and who gets stuck with the skimpy veiny bones. Of course, the pains are already dulled by the truck which ran me over, but the pulling and tugging of the stringed muscle and tendons does indeed cause intense distress. It's like the not knowing of where my daughter Whitney is. She's gone and I realize it. That pain was devastating until the time passed ushering in the numbness, but there is the occasional snippet of information on where she was seen, friends telling me of her looks of despair, her dropping off a birthday gift for Magpie, the blurred image of her placing the small gift on the front porch at 1 a.m., lessening her chance of seeing us. Instead, only being caught by the Ring camera, expecting us to deliver those gifts so we can watch her daughter become broken again. Another crushing lie explaining why her mommy is mentally damaged but still loves her. Knowing it's not enough of an answer to heal the wound reopened. These kinds of things are like the tearing of the dead flesh, the skin that died from the initial loss but still clings to the nerve endings for endless pangs of reminding hurt, doled out at their sick daughter's drug-induced whims. It's not fair. It's not fair to hold these things, these happenings, these pitfalls of life. It's as if Whitney were trying to cage her daughter, our sweet little Magpie, and she's forced me to be the wire bars of the cell holding her. Who released these dark angels upon me, Lord? The gnashing of my teeth and the weeping of my soul and eyes. How long will I be able to keep up the good fight against the dark thoughts? The haunting seems never ending, my world void of any light in front or behind me. I reach out to touch something, hoping to feel the warmth of another soul, one untainted by these evil winged monsters of mental anguish. But all I ever find is the harsh, cold bleakness of stone, unending and without hope. It feels as if I too am caged, my bars twisted and formed by my own fears and hurt. The cage I made that I'm housed in faces the cage our daughter created that holds our Magpie. And as I squint to try to make out her image through the dimness of the prison's yard, I notice Magpie's cage door hangs open and free to exit. But she is too frightened to attempt flight from her captivity. No mother to nudge her from the nest, likely not understanding she could escape if only. But where would she fly off to in such a dark and dank world void of love? I'm near her and want to hold her close to give comfort, but she can't see from the blanket of black tossed over her by her mother, hiding her daughter from her own sight, aiding as cover from her goddamned guilt of caring more about the drug fix than the dependent life she brought into this quagmire. Damn you for laying what you see as this troublesome boulder upon my shoulders. I'm not the Samson you saw me as. I'm weak and tired, and sometimes I feel the draw to the edge of the bridge that crosses the cold waters of eternal escape. Goliath calls my name in a mocking voice of a beautiful nymph or siren, tempting me to trust that those lustful cries will forever settle my constant torment this hellish world dealt me. I would beg to be allowed to surrender, but by doing so, the internal shame would be exposed for all to take notice and judge my weakness. That's right, goddammit. Pride is the strong root of the evil that drags me downward into the depths. Coraline's eyes were wet pools of overflowing tears. Her sobs weighted with the heaviness of granite. Her body heaved in waves of broken pain. I attempted comfort, but how helpful is a freshly broken cup to carry the warm consolatory elixir to another's suffering? All I could do was say, "I'm sorry, Coraline, but you see why I had to meet with you, don't you? This cover, these words." Coraline looked deep into my eyes with almost a child's questioning eyes, begging for answers I had no possession of. Why did he write this, Connor? Why? It's pain and evil and devastation. Did he really feel like this? Why couldn't he tell me? Or you were his best friend, for God's sake. You didn't see this coming? Or talk about any of this when you met every week? Did he intentionally drive off that fucking bridge? Is this what this is saying? How could I not see he was dying inside? I'm sorry, Coraline. I had no idea either. I didn't know he was so riven and splintered. As I read his book, I found myself constantly beating myself up for not seeing any of these signs. I'm a blind fool and a failed friend. My head dropped and I covered my tear-filled eyes, keeping Coraline from seeing them. I've canceled my flight home for now. I want to be here for you as long as you and Magpie need me. 6. I laid the book down on the table, face down as I couldn't look again at the image it held. I was empty. The goddamn book had been like a magnet drawn to me as if I were steel. I felt like each word from that book cut deep and tugged one more tidbit of mental flesh from my brain. As painful as it read, and as telling of the hidden turmoil as it was, David was right. It was powerful and his best writing. I couldn't imagine another author having written something with more potency within to tug at the reader's heart. His book had left me totally worn, ragged, and scarred, figuratively gasping in a pile on the floor after being run through with his written word sword, writhing in its aftermath. I didn't believe I could read another book of David's after reading this one. Even if he were still alive and writing, I wouldn't be able to understand the need. Once the last word of this book ran across my sensory mechanism and I'd closed it between my hands, I felt I'd been drawn and quartered. Fini. Coraline and I both now understood the world David had found himself helplessly trapped within. We had found it together, helping each other through the process. I think we both somehow even accepted the reasons he had kept such a world hidden from us. I think it was his way of protecting us from it. His final book being his way of warning us about the dark world's existence within the normal one most of us live. We both discussed what good would really come from publishing this final work of his. Did she really want this to be David's legacy left behind? We both agreed that this story, no matter how brilliant the superlatives were, was far too personal a story to be told to just anyone who could purchase it. It was dangerous in a way, hurtful. It had already been told to the two it was meant for, and should never be released to be exploited and misunderstood. Coraline then informed me of her little secret that she had kept from the world. She hadn't had David's body cremated for a reason. She told me it was because David's body may have not been recovered. There was a body found within the car, no doubt, but she believed it wasn't David's. She hadn't told the authorities because they already assumed it was. They never tested the DNA or dental work. But there was jewelry on his body that wasn't his. A necklace. One she had never seen before. She needed the option of future testing in case another body was ever found. She knew it sounded crazy, but once she had kept quiet at first, she felt unable to say anything different. And so, this part of his death had become a dark secret she would have to live with. It also gave her the mental gift of highest hope that one day David would show back up and rescue her and Magpie again as he had helped rescue her once before. It was her one and only hope at this point, and she couldn't give that tinge of hope up yet. On the day before I was to leave for my return trip to Seward, Alaska, Coraline and I set out to complete our final act in saying goodbye to David. It was a quiet and sad trip down Highway 13 to the bridge across Table Rock Lake. It reached out across the deepest waters immediately south of Kimberling City. We parked and walked midway, finding the welded repaired spot where David's car had broken through the side railing before crashing into the cold lake some 40 feet below to the waterline. The moon was full and traffic was non-existent. In fact, it was downright eerie and unearthly. We both shed tears while holding hands as we said our goodbyes to a man who had played very important roles in each of our lives. He had made his mark on many people, both friends and fans. I believe both of us felt somewhat guilty that we had decided not to make his final work available to them. But while it is against every fiber in my being to censor or burn any form of writing, I couldn't allow his final legacy be a dark, dirty smear of comparisons to his memory and how he likely chose to leave this world. As the clouds drifted between us and the moon darkened the moment even more, I looked over to Coraline for the nod and then dropped the only known copy of Never Cage a Magpie over the edge of the railing. We both stood quietly as we waited to hear the faint splash of its bound pages connect with the watery surface, knowing it would sink almost 200 feet below to the silted bottom of the frigid dark tomb that more than likely also encased the man that penned it. It was done, the act over, the goodbyes given, and the prayers of forgiveness completed. Fini. Coraline and I walked hand in hand back to the parked car where we climbed in, now sheltered from the cold night air, and drove home in silence. Coraline and Magpie would drive me to the airport in the morning. Coraline was gracious enough to let me stay in their home on my final night before departing back to Alaska. We played games and worked on a puzzle together. Magpie looked as if she were accepting the new world she was now living without her Grandpa David or Mommy Brandy. She loved her Grandma Coraline, and the two of them would be fine. I could see it in their eyes. Strong survivors had been born from this tragedy.
Uncle Connor, when are you going to come visit me and Grandma again? You aren't going to wait until somebody dies, are you?
No, Magpie, I won't wait until that happens, I promise. In fact, I've invited your grandma and you to come visit me in Seward, Alaska this July. Does that sound like fun?
Brr, it sounds cool, but I'll bring my heaviest coat. Will I get to see bears and mooses?
I'll see what I can do, sweet Magpie. At the airport terminal, Magpie pushed my rolling suitcase until it was to the point they could go no further with me to the gate. I reached over to Coraline and drew her into my arms and whispered, "Let's talk at least every other night. I want to make sure you two are good, and I'll be looking forward to showing you around Alaska this summer. I hope you stay as long as you like." I gave her a peck on her cheek and pulled back to see a warm gleam in her eyes. My heart felt strangely warm in that instant. I brushed the feeling to the side as I then turned and bent down on one knee to face Magpie. "Can I have one of those big squeeze hugs you used to give away all the time? I really miss those." She wrapped both arms around me as far as she could and made her huggy noise as she squeezed me tightly.
Ooh, I love you, Uncle Connor. I better give you 2, so they will last till your plane lands.
"You take good care of your grandma, Magpie. I'm counting on you." I pulled back and winked at her. Magpie leaned back in close and whispered in my ear,
I will. I'll take the bestest care of her. Do you think you might ever marry my grandma, so you can be my grandpa? It would make it easier not to cry so much. And I know my grandpa David wouldn't be mad."
An instant pain struck, much like I imagined a needle piercing my heart would feel. "Would that really help make you happy, sweetie?"
Yes, sir. It sure would. I know she likes you.
"Well, Magpie, we'll see how she feels in July. How about that?" I smiled at her and then looked up and smiled at Coraline. "See you two in July and talk to you when I land." When I opened the door to my home in Seward, I almost tripped over the pile of mail that had been poked through the mail slot in the front door. The first thing that caught my eye was a manila envelope laying on top. My heart raced and prickles rushed throughout my body in broad shivers. I bent down to pick it up, holding it close to my face to read whatever was written on the outside. It was like deja vu as I began to tear the edge open after not finding a return address on it anywhere. My fingers still chilled from the frigid air outside, I pulled the opening of the envelope wide enough to see a book. I walked over to my kitchen bar and spilled the contents onto the marble top. My eyes surely stood out as huge white orbs as a look of shock certainly washed over me. There was a picture of David on the back cover. It was blurred, with part of the image crystal clear. Hanging from his neck was a small silver necklace. Dangling from its chain were 2 charms. One was what looked like a bird in opened wing flight. The other, a bird cage with the door swung open. I couldn't help but wonder if there was an intended meaning with the predominant necklace in the clear part of the photo, while the upper part, his eyes, appeared blurred. The memory of Coraline speaking of a necklace found on the body, a necklace she didn't recognize, suddenly overwhelmed my brain. Quickly scanning the written book blurb, I took a deep breath before flipping the author's copy over to display the front cover and title. And there it was, bigger than life, a new novel with the letters D.D. Duvain boldly stamped across the bottom. My eyes traveled upward, looking for the title, my eyesight shooting past the graphics for now. "Oh my God," I spoke aloud. "What the hell have you done, David?" In bright iridescent blue, the color of a magpie's prominent stripe on its wing, was bold lettering. The font was less intimidating than the earlier books. The title didn't stir the same tension within. In fact, it was almost comforting and calming. The Healing of Magpie was emboldened over a beautiful young girl's soft-toned face. She looked a lot like Maggie May Duvain. In the background was the open door on a bird cage. The image of a bird soaring in free flight high above in the white clouds, fading into a bright-colored sunset over the water's horizon. This cover was as different from his last book as darkness is to daylight. I stood dumbfounded. I left my suitcase dumped alongside the rest of my piled mail and walked with David's book in my warming hands over to my reading chair. I turned up the heat on the gas log and flipped my reading light to its brightest setting, then sat down. I was mesmerized as I read a handwritten comment on the inside title page. "To my best friend in this world, Connor, I know you have more than likely suffered a gamut of emotions at my causing. Everything from wonder to frustration, love, anger to hate, and most everything in between. You know, I've always enjoyed toying with people's emotions, and yours would be included. I can't tell you where I am or what happened. You will assume, but I can neither confirm nor deny if I'm alive or stuck in a world running parallel to such a reality. I just know I am healed. I have no anxiety within or fears of what will happen next. My clouds have shaken the darkness and transformed into white. I now know in the end all will be well, and that is a comfort I've not been afforded for quite some time. Please take care of Coraline and Magpie as if they are now yours. You have my blessing. In fact, it is my request that if you can love them better than I, that you should do just that. You, my friend, are like the brother I lost too early in life and have forever longed for. I love you, brother. David. P.S. A fitting poem by an unknown author. It's an old nursery rhyme about magpies. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, and 4 for a boy, 5 for silver, 6 for gold, 7 for a secret never to be told. You have my blessing to let Coraline in on our little secret. I imagine this is a much more fitting book for her to enjoy than my last several. Someday, when the timing is right, please let my little Magpie know this secret too, and tell her I was always nearby, watching and loving her the entire time. I'm so sorry her mommy was so sick and pitiful. Please try to explain to her that that is indeed what she was, mentally sick and broken beyond repair. I shared my little Magpie's pain from the loss of Brandy also. We can't make people change or live like we want them to, no matter how much we love them and them to do so. I finally accepted that I did my best to save her, and there was nothing more that could be done. One must want to save themselves and not expect others to do so. She did love her little Magpie, though. I will always believe that. Brandy just didn't know how to walk the tight wire that was her path to a happy ending for all involved. I hope you enjoy the read, my good friend. Know that I've turned over a new leaf. The darkness has subsided into light, and the pain into a comforting happiness with contentment. My only regret is being separated from my dear family I love so much. And you, my dear friend, please help make them understand none of this was them. Even though I feel healed, that long path of brokenness never fully heals enough to know if you go back, you will survive any better. Understand, the leaving is not so dark and foreboding as the living can be. David. I sank down into the chair cushion, prepared for a long evening of reading. I turned page after page, amazed as usual, but in a much different flavor. Instead of dreading each page turn, fearing where the story may lead, I felt invigorated by each turn, almost racing to the next, feeling warmer within. My good friend was alive and back in a world filled with happiness and joy, even if he wasn't truly alive. I supposed I had never known for certain. This entire event was such a hard concept for me to get a grip on, but the hours passed as the chapters rolled on. I had not read through too many books in such a short time without a break. This one felt like I could start back at the beginning and never lose interest rereading it back to back immediately. Instead, though, I reached for my phone and dialed Coraline. She answered on the second ring, and I could hear Magpie's happy voice calling out,
Uncle Connor, I miss you, I love you, and I'm already ready to come freeze with you.
Me too, Magpie. Me too. I smiled briefly to myself, warm goosebumps invading my skin from head to toe. Coraline? Honey? You won't believe what David has done. Have I got a story for you?
Tales for Dark Nights.